The candlelight flickered against the stone walls of Riverrun's great hall, casting dancing shadows over the anxious figures gathered around the wooden war table. Robb Stark, king in the north by the acclamation of his bannermen, stood at the head of the table with his arms crossed over his chest. He wore a heavy cloak of wolf fur that lent him a regal presence, but his young face, though often hardened by the burdens of leadership, showed a deep and growing worry. The war was at a critical juncture, and every passing day, he felt as though he stood at a fork in the road with no clear path to victory. Every rumor of Sansa's plight in King's Landing stabbed at his conscience like a blade. She was his sister, his father's blood, and though they had never been particularly close, the thought of her in the hands of the Lannisters gnawed at him relentlessly. Catelyn Stark, tired and heartsore from too many battles and too many losses, stood by Robb's side, her hair streaked with gray from grief rather than age. She had traveled far to keep her family safe and the promises of House Tully alive, but each new piece of news brought greater challenges. She could see the struggle in her son's eyes, a mixture of anger and desperation, of bitterness and hope. Whispered reports from King's Landing told of Sansa's humiliation at Joffrey's court, how the girl was forced to endure the cruelty of the new king and the mocking eyes of courtiers who took pleasure in watching a hostage from the north suffer. Around the table, the northern lords awaited Robb's word. Ser Edmure Tully, newly returned from a skirmish on the fringes of the Riverlands, paced near the corner with restless energy. The great Jon stood, broad-shouldered and brimming with indignation, while Roose Bolton, quiet and calculating, kept his own counsel, hands folded over his chest. The hall was tinged with apprehension and uncertainty. Plans had been made and shattered countless times before. Allies had been gained and some lost. The war that once seemed so simple, avenge Ned Stark's death, carve out northern independence, now felt bogged down in 100 complexities. Robb's gaze swept over his supporters. He needed them steadfast, but he also knew the war had bled many houses dry of men and resources. Winter would come eventually, and the knowledge that the North must endure the hardest of seasons weighed on him. He pressed a hand over the table's worn surface. Maps and figures lay scattered, a testament to the chaos of planning. He took a breath and tried to steady himself. "My lords," Robb said, his voice resonating through the hall, "we have fought bravely, and many have given their lives for our cause. We aim to free the North from the rule of the Iron Throne and take vengeance on those who killed my father. But I fear we may find ourselves fighting on too many fronts, and the cost is rising. I will not pretend that the last year has not worn us all thin." The Greyjohn's mouth twitched with anger, but he said nothing immediately. He had always been the first to roar for a charge, the man who had shouted, "The King in the North," at the top of his lungs. But these were precarious times. He had lost good men, dear friends, and kin in bloody battles across the Trident and beyond. Now, even he could sense that simple bravery and unrelenting aggression might no longer be enough. "I have received new tidings from King's Landing," Robb continued, swallowing hard. Word came through a whispering chain of informants, good men who risked their lives. They say Sansa is still being kept under strict watch. Joffrey's moods grow more dangerous by the day, and she stands at risk of unspeakable cruelties. I cannot let her remain a pawn in Cersei's and Joffrey's games. Catelyn's face tightened, and her hand came to rest lightly on Robb's shoulder. She had not been able to protect her husband, her daughters, or her younger sons, who were far away in Winterfell, Bran and Rickon, but she still clung to the hope of saving Sansa and Arya. Of Arya, there had been only rumors. Of Sansa, they had near certain intelligence that she was in the Red Keep. "Your Grace," Roose Bolton said in a measured tone, "if Sansa remains a hostage, the Lannisters can use her as leverage. That alone should guide our next move." Robb listened, though he was also thinking of another, more shocking strategy that had crossed his mind in the dark hours of the night. It felt like betrayal of everything his father had taught him, of every vow he had made when they declared him king in the North. But the horrors that might befall Sansa were also unthinkable. In the swirl of his thoughts, a cunning, desperate idea emerged. Would it be right to sacrifice the North's hard-won independence for Sansa's safety? Could he give up his crown, the oath his men had sworn, in exchange for one life? Catelyn saw the conflict etched on her son's face. She had glimpsed it before, in the quieter moments, when he studied the maps and murmured about Sansa. She took a moment to steady her voice before she spoke. Robb, the men will not take kindly to any thought of yielding. Many have died because we swore an oath to be free of the Iron Throne. They followed you because they believed in you and in vengeance for your father. Yet, Sansa is your sister. She is a Stark of Winterfell. Robb forced himself to stand tall and look upon the gathering. My father believed in duty, honor, and family, he said quietly. The very words of House Tully speak of family, duty, honor. And though I am a Stark, those words burn in my blood as well. I cannot sit idle while my sister is at the mercy of the Lannisters. The Great John slammed his fist down on the table, causing tankards and plates to rattle. Then let us march on King's Landing, he growled. Why offer anything when we can simply go and take what is ours? Ser Edmure gave him a frustrated look. We do not have the numbers. Tywin Lannister is no fool. As long as the Tyrells back the Lannisters, or at least remain neutral, their combined forces outnumber us. Marching on King's Landing would be folly, a suicide mission. Our men are brave, but they can't withstand a host twice their size, entrenched behind the city's walls. The Great John let out a deep breath through his nose, clearly wanting to argue, but lacking a solid retort. He cast his gaze to Robb, awaiting a more measured explanation. Robb's eyes traveled across the faces of his bannermen. Men who had pledged loyalty, men who had watched friends and family die for the cause of northern independence. I will speak plainly, Robb said. Our war is at a standstill. My father's killer sits in King's Landing, and it seems we can't break their hold on Sansa. With every passing day, the Red Wedding rumor grows in my mind, that Walder Frey might betray us if we push him too far or fail to deliver on our marriage alliance. The Boltons might question the cause if we starve for resources. The Karstarks have already shown their dissatisfaction with how we handle hostages. And the Lannisters, they profit from our lack of unity. He paused, letting the tension permeate. Then, in a voice heavy with resolve, he said the words that had haunted him for nights on end. I propose we offer Tywin Lannister the North in exchange for Sansa's safe return. A stunned silence followed. It felt as though the flickering of the candles stilled, as though all the air had been sucked out of the hall. Some men bristled, some gaped. The Great John opened his mouth to roar, but no sound emerged at first. Ser Edmure's eyes went wide with alarm. Roose Bolton's lips thinned into a line, revealing little of his thoughts. And Catelyn placed her hand over her heart, as though the weight of her son's words had pressed into her chest. You cannot be serious, Great John Umber finally spat, voice shaking with anger. We declared you king in the North. After all the bloodshed, after all the families that have lost their sons. You would hand our kingdom to Tywin Lannister? For one hostage, Catelyn exhaled shakily. She is more than one hostage. She is Sansa Stark. She is your daughter, Great John said in a gruff tone. But we have bled for this war. We raised our swords to avenge Lord Eddard. We will not bow to the likes of Tywin Lannister because of a single piece in the game. Robb's expression hardened. I have made no final decision. I bring it before you because I value your counsel. But listen to me, we are not in a position of strength. It breaks my heart to say it, but what if forging a peace? Some arrangement that ensures Sansa's safety and perhaps an end to further slaughter. What if that is the best path left to us? A bitter hush fell. For a long, tense moment, everyone in the room wrestled with Robb's suggestion. It felt like a betrayal to speak of giving the North back to the Iron Throne, especially to House Lannister. Yet, there was a kernel of undeniable truth in what Robb said. The war was draining them. They had won victories in the field, twice capturing Jaime Lannister, but Tywin remained a formidable foe, one with cunning far beyond most lords' capacity. Catelyn spoke gently, her hand still on her son's arm. There may be another way, Robb. We could negotiate for Sansa's release without surrendering the entire north. An exchange of valuable prisoners, perhaps gold, or some alliance less total. Edmure Tully cleared his throat. We have Ser Jaime in our custody, though he's not here at Riverrun but at the outskirts of our domain under heavy guard. The Lannisters would want him back, without question, especially Lord Tywin. Jaime is his heir. Perhaps that is leverage enough. Robb considered the suggestion, but he was aware that had been the original plan: trade Jaime for the girls. The problem was that Tywin had been furious when Catelyn had once freed Jaime without the proper arrangement. Though, in truth, that had been her desperate move, not an official exchange. Now, the Lannisters might demand something more binding. Moreover, Joffrey had crowned himself king of the Seven Kingdoms, and the North's independence was a direct affront to that claim. Simply returning Jaime for Sansa might not hold if Joffrey's or Cersei's taste for cruelty outweighed their care for Jaime. Still, the notion of giving up the North in its entirety made Robb's stomach churn. Could he truly do that to honor, to memory, to all who had bled? He ran a hand through his curls, fighting the sting of guilt. We will attempt smaller concessions first, but I cannot ignore that Tywin may demand something outrageous. And if he does, what will we do? Roose Bolton, who until now had been quiet, finally spoke in his calm, measured voice. Your Grace, I cannot speak for all houses, but I know that House Bolton would weigh the benefits carefully. The cost of continuing this war is substantial. If Tywin Lannister offered leniency, if we become wards of the Iron Throne again, some might find it more agreeable than an endless campaign. There is no surer path to preserving our power in the long term than ensuring we are not crushed under the weight of Lannister gold and Tyrell food supplies. That made some of the Northmen scowl. The Boltons were known for being pragmatic, sometimes disturbingly so. The Great John muttered a curse under his breath. Bolton is an opportunist, looking to save his own hide. Would you hand over our entire kingdom out of fear? Do not mistake realism for cowardice, Roose Bolton said in a quiet but dangerous tone. If the king in the north sees fit to offer terms, then we would do well to discuss them rationally. If not, then let us gather every man and fight to the last. But we cannot exist halfway between victory and ruin. The words hung in the air. Robb was painfully aware that the seeds of division were sprouting among his bannermen. He needed to lead, but he also needed to act with caution, especially when the stakes were this high. Finally, with a tired wave of his hand, he ended the council meeting, saying they would reconvene in the morning. The lords filtered out of the hall slowly, some in heated whispers, others in stony silence. The Great John, face flushed, left with an angered grunt, while Bolton glided away with quiet composure. Edmure lingered, anxious lines etched on his brow, and eventually retired with a heavy sigh. Catelyn remained by Robb's side, and once the great hall was empty save for the servants gathering the leftovers of the night's meal, she pulled her son aside into a corner of the chamber. She looked at him as if seeing him anew. He was a boy forced to wear a man's crown, compelled to make decisions that even the most seasoned lords would shrink from. Gently, she placed a hand against his cheek. "Robb, my sweet boy," she began, her voice cracking. "I know your heart is torn. You want to save Sansa, to honor your father's memory, and at the same time you must lead an entire kingdom. You bear the weight of so many lives on your shoulders." Robb could not help the tears that pricked at the corners of his eyes, though he did not let them fall. He carefully took his mother's hand. "I wish father were here," he said softly, "or that I were older, wiser. Every time I think I see a path forward, the cost to our cause seems too high, or the cost to our family is too great. And Tywin Lannister, he's a monster, but a brilliant one." Catelyn's gaze was steady. "Your father's sense of honor would have put family first, but he also understood the burden of leadership. He died for a principle, that the truth mattered more than bending to corruption. We must be careful to honor him, but also remember that he would do what was necessary to keep the innocent from harm. Sansa is not a piece in this game, but a living, breathing child of Winterfell. And if offering some concession to Tywin would save her from torment, Eddard would have considered it. But that does not mean we must yield everything without cunning. We can negotiate, offer enough that Tywin sees a profit, but not so much that the north is left kneeling. Robb nodded, feeling a mixture of gratitude and anguish. I have to try. Let me see if I can talk sense into Lord Tywin. Perhaps Jaime is enough to entice him, or maybe gold or an alliance. But if all else fails... He did not finish the sentence, but Catelyn grasped his implication. A day later, envoys were dispatched. Letters were penned by Robb's own hand. Letters that bore the seal of the king in the north. Letters that would be carried under flags of truce to King's Landing. In them, Robb proposed an exchange of prisoners. Sansa Stark for Jaime Lannister. He also suggested a peaceful cessation of open hostilities in return for certain trade concessions. The letters were carefully worded to hint at the possibility of larger concessions if Tywin was willing to negotiate. Though he did not explicitly offer the entire north, Robb planted the seed. He knew how clever Tywin was. The man would read between the lines. Weeks passed, each day longer than the last as winter's chill began its slow creep southward. The outriders brought little news of the letter's reception at first, until one gray morning when a messenger arrived at Riverrun's gates under the heraldry of House Lannister, a red lion on a golden field. The messenger, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and a meticulous look, handed over a sealed parchment without ceremony. It was addressed to Robb Stark and bore the unmistakable wax seal of Tywin Lannister. Robb read it in private first, then shared the contents with his mother and his most trusted bannermen in the war room. Tywin's missive was brief, almost chillingly so. Robb Stark, I have received your overtures. You speak of returning my son Jaime in exchange for the girl you call Sansa, the ward of King Joffrey. You hint at trade concessions and the potential for greater arrangement. I am prepared to consider your proposal under certain conditions. Your sister's return to you, with certain assurances regarding the continued loyalty of the North to the Iron Throne, may be possible. I will require a meeting of envoys with guarantees of safe passage on both sides to discuss terms. In your response, name a suitable location, and we will proceed. Tywin Lannister, Hand of the King, Shield of Lannisport, Warden of the West. Robb sat down heavily after reading the letter to the room. Tywin was playing the game with well-honed skill, naming himself Hand of the King, even though Tyrion had once been acting hand. But he was effectively in control, everyone knew that. The letter was cagey, refusing to state outright that Sansa would be traded for Jaime. Instead, it insisted on certain assurances, which likely meant precisely what Robb feared, the bending of northern knees. This is a trap, the great Jon grunted, crossing his arms. We'll go to meet them, and they'll turn on us. Roose Bolton arched an eyebrow. We have done the same to others, have we not? Or at least considered it. It is the way of war. But if we are careful, if the location is neutral ground, we might mitigate the risks. We could bring enough men to discourage betrayal, while not so many as to appear threatening. Catelyn looked at the letter again. He specifically requests we name a location. We have some measure of advantage in that. If we choose a site well within our domain, we could host the meeting in a fortress or a camp that we control. It could reduce the possibility of treachery. But that leaves them less likely to attend, Edmure noted. Tywin might demand a more central location. Harrenhal, perhaps. But the Lannisters have had men in Harrenhal. Harrenhal is a cursed place, Catelyn said with a shudder. Though it might be neutral in name, we know Tywin's men have held it. And Lord Bolton has also had an interest there. Roose Bolton nodded, still revealing little of his personal stance. Harrenhal might be the only location Tywin finds acceptable. He has an attachment to that ruin, ironically enough. Robb considered carefully. We can propose an open field near the God's Eye. We will camp in full view of the Lannisters. We can arrange pavilions under banners of truce. Or we could do the twins, Edmure suggested darkly, though he quickly added. But that puts Walder Frey into the equation, and I don't trust that man. Nor do I, Robb agreed. I will not place our destiny in Walder Frey's hands again. An open field near the God's Eye might work. Let us craft our response. We will insist on them bringing Sansa. We will bring Jaime. We will each have a retinue of no more than 100 men. We will station watchers at a distance. If we see more than 100 Lannister soldiers approach, the meeting is off." There were nods around the table, though the tension remained thick. The stakes were enormous. Catelyn watched Robb as he drew up the response, feeling both pride and heartbreak. He was leading as best he could, forging a new path in a war that had grown beyond their control. She prayed silently to the Seven, and to the old gods, that this path would not end in more bloodshed or the final ruin of House Stark. The letters were written, sealed, and dispatched. In the following weeks, preparations were made for the meeting. Robb chose several bannermen to accompany him, including the Great John, who insisted on coming to ensure the king in the north did not sign away their freedoms without protest, and Roose Bolton, who seemed to have a knack for reading Tywin's cunning. Catelyn would also come, to see her daughter if the meeting bore fruit. Edmure remained at Riverrun, to guard the seat of House Tully and maintain order in their rear lines. Throughout, the men trained, sharpened swords, checked armor, and cast easy glances at their young king. Rumors circled. Was Robb truly considering giving the North to Tywin Lannister? Some found it unthinkable. Others believed that if it saved Lady Sansa and ended the bleeding, perhaps it was worth it. Jaime Lannister, kept under heavy guard, was informed that he might soon be traded. The Kingslayer put on a sardonic smile. "So the young wolf is finally thinking sensibly," he drawled, leaning against the cold stone wall of his holding cell. "He'll bend the knee, and I'll be on my merry way." The guard glowered but offered no reply. Jaime couldn't resist a mocking laugh. "You Northerners are so proud. You say you'll never bend, never break. Yet here I am, still breathing. You should thank the gods for your king's motherly instincts." Despite his bravado, Jaime was not entirely calm. He understood that Tywin's terms might be ruthless, and he wondered if the young wolf would truly give up everything just to get his sister back. Still, he counted on his father's cunning. Tywin would fight tooth and nail to keep his heir alive. Even if he loathed Jaime's mockery, he would never let the Lannister line die. At last, the day of the meeting dawned under a leaden sky that threatened rain. Robb rode out from Riverrun at the head of 100 men. They bore the direwolf sigil, their banners fluttering in a cold wind. Jaime was escorted in a caged wagon, manacled and guarded by fierce-eyed Northmen determined not to let him escape. Behind them came Catelyn, riding in a small covered carriage for comfort, though she insisted on no more than a thin guard so as not to provoke the Lannisters. Roose Bolton rode near Robb, silent and pale, the flayed man of House Bolton on his banners. The Great John rode on the other side, thunderous in countenance, the giant of House Umber on his own flags. A hush seemed to lie over the Riverlands, as though the land itself held its breath. When they approached the chosen field near the God's Eye, Robb's scouts signaled that a Lannister host was already in place. From afar, they could see golden lions dancing on crimson banners in the morning light. War tents, carefully arranged, dotted the grassy expanse. The narrow line of 100 Lannister men stood armed and ready, formed in neat ranks of polished armor. At their center, a larger pavilion had been erected, presumably for the negotiations. The land around them was flat and open, giving each side a clear view. There would be no easy ambushes here, though caution was still paramount. Robb formed his men in a line opposite the Lannisters. The Great John muttered that they should keep the caged wagon with Jaime some distance behind, so no Lannister fool might attempt a sudden rescue. Then, accompanied only by Catelyn, Roose Bolton, and 2 standard-bearers, Robb proceeded to the pavilion, carrying an air of regal calm. Beneath his furs and armor, his heart was pounding. Inside the pavilion stood Lord Tywin Lannister, tall and imposing despite his age. His hair had gone gray-white, yet his green eyes retained their piercing sharpness. He wore a finely wrought breastplate of gold and steel, and a heavy cloak trimmed with red silk. Flanking him were men of importance. Kevan Lannister, his brother, stoic and unwavering. Several other Lannister cousins, and a few knights of the Kingsguard, their white cloaks draped over plate armor. The sight of them made Catelyn's pulse quicken. She scanned the group, desperately seeking a glimpse of her daughter. Sansa was not there, but a young lady with a wimple and a silver chain stepped forward, introducing herself as Lady Tina of Myr, some court lady in Cersei's circle, evidently. She curtsied with polite formality, though the courtesy seemed perfunctory. Tywin's cold gaze flicked over each northerner before settling on Robb. "King in the north," Tywin said, his deep voice laced with a hint of challenge. "I trust the journey was not too arduous." Robb inclined his head. "Lord Tywin, we came to discuss the release of my sister, Sansa Stark, and the cessation of hostilities." Tywin's lips tightened into a faint smile. "Yes, we shall speak of such things. But first, let me see my son." The old lion's gaze traveled beyond Robb, clearly searching for any sign of Jaime. "He is in the wagon outside," Roose Bolton answered smoothly. "We did not wish any unfortunate surprises. But he is in good health and ready to be exchanged, provided our terms are met." Tywin nodded, as though he expected no less. "Very well. Let us sit and speak." He gestured to a table in the center of the pavilion. Servants brought chairs and small goblets of wine. The Lannister retinue took positions behind Tywin, while Robb and his mother faced them. Roose stood just off Robb's shoulder, watchful. The Great Jon, scowling at the entire affair, stood like a boulder near the entrance, arms folded. Tywin began with a measured tone. "House Lannister holds Lady Sansa in King's Landing as a ward of the crown. She is betrothed, at least in theory, to King Joffrey. Now, however, the king may reconsider that betrothal, given her family's treasonous stance. Nonetheless, I have influence. If I were to order it, Sansa would be delivered to you. But that begs the question, what do I gain from this transaction?" Robb met Tywin's gaze, trying to project confidence. "You gain the return of Jaime Lannister, your heir, a man of singular importance to your house. Is that not enough?" Tywin steepled his fingers, voice unhurried. "In other circumstances, perhaps. But you declared yourself king in the north, severed ties with the Iron Throne, and waged war against the crown. The cost to my house has been high. The gold we've poured into the war is substantial, and men have died on both sides. My grandson, King Joffrey, cannot simply ignore a rebellion in the north. If we return your sister and you return Jaime, the conflict remains unresolved unless you bend the knee." A hush fell over the pavilion. The faintest tremor passed through Robb's expression. This was the moment he had dreaded. Tywin was not interested in half measures. He wanted total submission. Robb said nothing for a moment, weighing his words. He felt the Great Jon's baleful glare on his back, felt his mother's tension at his side. When he finally spoke, his tone was controlled. "You must understand, Lord Tywin, that the men of the North are fiercely independent. We declared ourselves free because the Iron Throne had betrayed us, had executed my father under false pretenses, and had treated us as expendable. Do you truly believe we can simply rejoin the fold as though none of that happened?" Tywin studied him, expression unreadable. "A king must be prepared to enforce his will through consequences. Your father was executed for treason by King Joffrey's command, not mine, though I supported that decision when he confessed." He paused. "If you yield, you will be pardoned. The houses that sided with you will be required to swear loyalty once more. The North would pay restitution in gold or resources for the trouble. Jaime would be returned to us at once, and your sister, with all courtesy, would be delivered to your keeping, her betrothal to Joffrey annulled, if that is your wish." Catelyn's voice shook slightly. "And how can we trust you? The Lannisters' reputation is not built on mercy." Tywin's features hardened. "Your daughter would be returned under my personal authority. I do not give my word lightly, Lady Stark. If I say she will be returned to you, I mean it." The Great Jon made a sound of derision, but Robb silenced him with a subtle gesture. Summoning the courage to continue, Robb addressed Tywin firmly. "And if we do not yield the North, if we insist on an exchange of Jaime for Sansa without bending the knee, what then?" Tywin almost smirked. "Then no arrangement can be reached. You will keep Jaime, or perhaps kill him in your frustration. We will keep Sansa. The war will drag on. The North will bleed. Perhaps you will hold out for a time, but do not underestimate the Crown's resources. The gold of Casterly Rock and the might of Highgarden stand behind us. We can sustain a longer war than you. Winter is coming, yes? And how will you feed your people when your trade routes are cut off? Robb clenched his jaw. He knew Tywin's logic was sound. The North needed the harvests of the Riverlands, and with the Tyrells supplying King's Landing, the Lannisters could hold the city indefinitely. Already, the fighting in the south had yielded no decisive advantage, and as time ground on, the advantage shifted to those with deeper pockets. Roose Bolton spoke up, voice smooth. Lord Tywin, if the king in the north were to yield, would that end the hostilities at once? Would the north be allowed to govern itself under a warden, or must we endure direct rule from the crown's officials? Tywin considered Roose's question. The north would be placed back under the governance of House Stark as wardens of the north, if your liege chooses to kneel and is accepted by his grace. Of course, we would require significant guarantees of loyalty. Hostages, perhaps, or other forms of surety. Catelyn's face blanched at the thought of more hostages. More Stark children or Northern Scions forced to remain in King's Landing. But Tywin's demands were hardly surprising. This was the nature of the game. For a moment, no one spoke. Robb could feel his heart pounding in his ears. This was the fork in the road. Yield, get Sansa back, and end the war, or refuse, cling to independence, and risk losing Sansa forever. Tywin took Robb's silence as an invitation to press. I see the conflict in you, boy, he said softly. You want your sister safely returned. You also want to honor your father's memory. But Eddard Stark was a pragmatic man in many ways, even if he could not see all the angles. Do not let your pride lead thousands to needless death. At that, Robb's anger flared. Do not speak of my father, he hissed. He was an honorable man, and you took part in his murder. Do not pretend to lecture me on his memory. Tywin's face was unmoved. I speak only truth. Honor can be a cloak for pride. If you mean to say you are willing to keep fighting, that is your choice, but it will mean your sister remains our hostage, her fate left to a boy king's temper, and your men will continue to die. If you are content with that, so be it. I merely point out the realities. Catelyn placed a hand on Robb's wrist, imploring him to remain calm. The Great John was almost trembling with fury, but he kept himself in check. Roose Bolton, on the other hand, wore a carefully neutral expression. Finally, Robb closed his eyes briefly and let out a measured breath. I will not make a final decision this moment. We will break for a time. I will consult with my bannermen. Tywin inclined his head. Very well. I will await your answer, but do not keep me waiting too long. Robb nodded curtly and led his retinue out of the pavilion. Once outside, the Great John exploded in low-voiced rage. The nerve of that lion bastard, threatening us with starvation with Joffrey's cruelty. And are you truly considering kneeling before them, Robb? His eyes burned with a mixture of betrayal and desperation. Roose Bolton spoke before Robb could answer. If we do not come to an accord, we lose Sansa's freedom, and the war continues. That is the simple truth. And we might lose anyway, Robb said in a hollow tone. I do not say that lightly, but look at the state of things. The Karstarks are angry with us for not spilling Jaime's blood when he killed their men. The Freys are barely held to our side by a thread, and we have not yet fulfilled the marriage arrangement that I am supposed to. Catelyn's lips pursed, recalling Robb's secret wedding to Talisa Maegor, a matter that complicated the Frey alliance. We have precarious allies, yes, and that only benefits Tywin. He can exploit any weakness. We must hold another war council, Robb decided. But time is short. Lord Tywin expects an answer. They returned to their own set of tents, placed at a safe distance. A smaller pavilion was erected for the king in the north, though it was modest compared to Tywin's lavish tent. Inside, Robb, Catelyn, the Great John, Roose Bolton, and a few other trusted lords gathered. The tension was palpable. Robb explained what Tywin demanded. The North's renewed fealty, restitution, hostages, and in return, Sansa's freedom, Jaime's exchange, and an end to the war. He did not mention the possibility that the North could remain under Stark rule as wardens, though Tywin had said it. Robb let his lords debate the bare bones first. The Great John was predictably incensed. "Your Grace, kneeling to Tywin is an abomination. After all we have sacrificed, we'd be mocking our own dead. And what if Tywin or Joffrey reneges on their word the moment we lay down arms?" Roose Bolton spoke with cool precision. "We would not lay down arms until Sansa is safely in our hands and the terms are ratified. Likely, Tywin would want Jaime in his hands first. It would be a delicate dance." Another lord, Galbart Glover, cleared his throat. "The men are exhausted, the river lords as well. Edmure Tully complains of constant raids and burned fields. Winter is coming, indeed, and the small folk suffer. How many more can we ask to die in a war that has no certain victory? Perhaps the Great John sees only the honor of continuing to fight, but in practical terms, how many more men can we lose?" The Great John bristled, but he did not interrupt as Glover went on. "I loved Lord Eddard. I love House Stark. But I cannot ignore that each day we fight is another day of hunger, of families left fatherless." A debate raged in that tent for hours. Some lords saw sense in seeking terms, believing that living under a Lannister-dominated crown might be better than endless bloodshed. Others felt it was a betrayal of Ned Stark and all the men who died believing in the North's right to rule itself. The Great John was the fiercest critic, but even he could see the war's toll on their forces. Robb watched this argument, an internal battle mirroring the external. Part of him flared with Stark pride, wanting to stand defiant, lead a daring campaign to rescue Sansa by force if necessary. But he had no illusions about the near impossibility of storming King's Landing. Another part, the part that loved his sister, that felt his father's memory urging him to protect family above all else, wondered if the price was too high to pay for a crown. The men's voices merged into a din in his ears. Catelyn eventually spoke, her voice a hush that cut through the noise. "I will not see another of my children lost to Lannister cruelty. If there is a chance to save Sansa, we must consider it. You are king, Robb, but I beg you to think of her life." Roose Bolton inclined his head in agreement, softly adding, "And to think of our future, if we continue a losing war." The Great John's fist pounded on the table. "It's not lost yet. We can unify the River Lords, call on the Blackfish, harass the Lannisters at every turn." Yet, even with his words, he sounded less certain than he once had, as if the realities of attrition were finally sinking in. Robb stared down at the table at a map of the Seven Kingdoms. The lines dividing the North from the rest now mocked him. He raked a hand through his hair, torn by conflicting loyalties. He knew that, in truth, the vow he had made to protect his family must come first. His father's sense of duty was etched in him. Protect the weak, keep your oaths, shield your kin. And had they not all pledged themselves to House Stark precisely because of that ethos? Finally, Robb straightened, feeling an odd calm settle over him. "Enough," he said quietly. Everyone fell silent, turning to face him. "I will agree to Tywin's terms, provided they are as he said. Sansa returned to us, safe and unharmed, Jaime exchanged, and the North allowed to govern itself as it did before, with House Stark as wardens. We will kneel to the Iron Throne and swear fealty, and in exchange the war ends. No further vengeance, no more bloodshed. That is my final decision." The Great John let out a pained snarl. "If that is your will, my king, then I will abide by it, though it breaks my heart." Catelyn's eyes brimmed with tears. She clasped Robb's hand and nodded. Roose Bolton's face betrayed a fleeting hint of satisfaction. In that moment, the North's independence, won on the battlefield, began to slip away. It was for a noble cause, for the life of a Stark daughter, but it still felt like a heavy sacrifice. Word was sent to Tywin that evening. Robb demanded assurances. Sansa must be brought to the pavilion the following morning to confirm her well-being. Once he confirmed that it was indeed Sansa, alive and unharmed, Robb would produce Jaime. The two would be exchanged simultaneously. Then, under the banner of peace, Robb would kneel, acknowledging Joffrey as king and Tywin as the hand. Agreements would be signed guaranteeing the security of the North. At dawn, the Northerners arrayed themselves on one side of the field. Robb wore his crown for what might be the last time, a simple circlet of bronze and iron hammered in the shape of a direwolf's head. His expression was stoic, though inside, his nerves were raw. Jaime waited behind them, manacled but uncaged. It was a delicate moment. Catelyn stood close to Robb, anxiously scanning the Lannister lines for any sign of her daughter. Finally, the Lannisters emerged, led by Tywin once again, with the Kingsguard knights flanking a cloaked figure. The hush across both forces was absolute, as though even the wind had fallen silent. When they reached the middle of the field, Tywin gestured, and a knight pulled back the cloak to reveal Sansa Stark. She looked thinner than before, paler, and her eyes held a haunted look. Yet, she was unmistakably Sansa, alive, breathing, and seemingly uninjured. Catelyn let out a choked sob. Robb felt something twist hard in his chest. His sister was there, flesh and blood, but the fear in her eyes spoke volumes of what she had endured. He wanted to run to her, embrace her, but caution held him in place. They had to follow the protocol to ensure the exchange happened smoothly. Tywin spoke. As promised, Sansa Stark, you may approach and confirm her identity, but do so unarmed. Robb passed his sword to the Greatjon, who accepted it with a grim nod. He walked forward alone, his boots crunching on the grass. The knights of the Kingsguard tensed, but Tywin lifted a hand to calm them. Robb faced Sansa, taking her hands gently. He saw tears gathering in her eyes, though she forced a small smile. "It's me, Robb," she whispered, voice trembling. "I knew you'd come." Robb bit back a surge of emotion. "Sansa," he murmured, "I'm sorry it took so long." He glanced over her for injuries. He saw no fresh bruises or cuts, but that didn't mean she hadn't been hurt in other ways. The red keeps cruelty often left invisible scars. "We'll have you safe soon," he promised. He straightened, turning to Tywin. "Very well. Sansa is alive and well." Tywin nodded curtly. "Have your men bring my son forward. Then we will conclude the matter of loyalty." With a nod from Robb, Roose Bolton and another guard escorted Jaime Lannister toward the center of the field. Jaime's usual confident smirk was subdued. He scanned the surroundings, noticing the armed Northerners, the steely glare of Tywin. His father, for his part, allowed no flicker of relief to show on his face, but the tension in the lines of his body eased slightly upon seeing Jaime safe. The exchange itself was swift. Sansa stepped out of the Lannister ranks and moved to Robb's side, while Jaime was handed over to the Lannisters. The two hostages, each precious to their respective houses, crossed paths under the watchful eyes of dozens of armed men. For a moment, Sansa locked eyes with Jaime. A faint apology or regret might have flashed in Jaime's expression. He was not blind to the cost of his own freedom. Then the moment was past. Catelyn rushed to Sansa the instant her foot crossed the halfway point. She embraced her daughter fiercely, tears streaming down her cheeks. Sansa clung to her mother, trembling with relief, sorrow, and confusion. Robb swallowed a lump in his throat, resting a hand on his sister's shoulder. Tywin drew in a breath. "You have the girl. I have my son. Now, about your vow of fealty. If you would, King in the North, or should I say, Lord of Winterfell?" Robb closed his eyes, feeling the weight of it. Slowly, he removed the bronze crown from his head. He held it for a moment, the significance of the gesture heavy in the air. Then, in front of his assembled men and the Lannisters, he knelt on one knee. The Greatjon made a pained sound but did not move to stop him. Catelyn, tears still damp on her cheeks, held Sansa's hand as they watched Robb's moment of capitulation. Robb's voice rang out, steady though laced with sorrow. "I, Robb Stark, do hereby swear fealty to King Joffrey Baratheon and his rightful successors. I return the North to the realm of the Seven Kingdoms and vow to honor the Crown's laws and keep its peace. My father was declared a traitor under uncertain circumstances, but I pledge that our houses shall put aside their grievances and seek a lasting accord." He rose to his feet and presented the crown to Tywin. Though Tywin was not the king, he was the hand, the one who truly wielded power in Joffrey's name. Tywin took the crown in his hands, studying it as though it were a curiosity, a relic of foolish ambition. Then he offered a tight nod. So witnessed, he passed the crown to a nearby guard. Robb felt a leaden emptiness settle over him. The war was over, at least for him and his men, but the price had been dear. He caught the eye of the great Jon, who gave a curt nod, jaw clenched. The northern men watched in somber silence, some shifting uncomfortably, as though expecting shame to fall on them. But if there was any scorn in Tywin's gaze, he did not voice it. He merely said, "We will draft an official agreement that binds this arrangement. The Stark lands shall remain under your governance as wardens of the North, so long as you keep your oath. We will require 1 or 2 hostages, though not necessarily from House Stark, as a measure of good faith. The details can be hammered out, but for now, the war between House Stark and the Iron Throne is ended." Robb stood there, uncertain whether to feel relief or despair. Sansa was safe at last. That one thought lit a spark of joy in him, overshadowing everything else for a moment. He turned to his sister and gently clasped her hand, as though to reassure himself that she was really there. His men watched quietly, grappling with their own internal storms. Some felt betrayed, others felt relief, and a few were simply glad to see the fighting done. The Greyjoy's fury was tempered by the sight of Sansa's trembling form. "Come," Tywin said, "let us formalize what we must. Lady Stark, you should see that Sansa is well attended to. My maester will examine her if necessary. There need be no further unpleasantness." He gave Jaime a sharp look. Jaime, standing behind his father, arched an eyebrow but said nothing. Kevan Lannister moved to speak quietly with him, checking his condition. Catelyn, wanting to remove Sansa from the Lannister presence immediately, signaled to Robb. She and Sansa were escorted back to the northern tents, where Catelyn brought her daughter into a private space away from prying eyes. There, mother and daughter finally released the flood of emotion. Sansa wept openly, clinging to her mother. They spoke haltingly at first, Sansa recounting some of her experiences in King's Landing. She mentioned the jeers from Joffrey, the humiliations, how Cersei had forced her to dress in gowns that displayed House Lannister's colors. The horror of watching her father's execution still haunted her dreams. But she was alive and now with her family again. Catelyn could only whisper comforting words, promising never to let her out of sight. Meanwhile, under Tywin's direction, the formalities proceeded. The Lannister scribes recorded the terms of the peace, writing out that Robb Stark relinquished any claim to kingship and recognized Joffrey as his liege lord. In return, House Stark would be confirmed as Wardens of the North, subject to the Crown's authority. Minimal reparations were to be paid, mostly in the form of shipments of iron and lumber from the north to King's Landing, to help rebuild war-ravaged areas. 2 hostages from among the northern lords would be required to reside in King's Landing for a period of 3 years to ensure continued loyalty. Tywin paused over the selection of these hostages, glancing at Robb with a cold, assessing eye. Perhaps the heir to the Dreadfort and one other, Tywin mused. Does Lord Bolton have a son? Roose Bolton inclined his head. Ramsay Snow is not my true-born son, he said quietly, though I might see him legitimized. If you desire him as a hostage, I will accept, my lord. Snow, is it? Tywin's eyes narrowed. A bastard, but perhaps that will suffice. The other hostage might be from a different house. We must ensure there is a broad measure of security. Perhaps one from House Serwyn or House Tallheart. Robb wanted to protest the taking of hostages, but he knew it was part of the usual terms. Many had died to get to this point. He decided to compromise. Take Harrion Karstark, Robb said. He is young, but a suitable pledge. The Karstarks owe a debt to the crown as well. He glanced at Roose, noticing no protest from him. Ramsay Snow and Harrion Karstark, then. Tywin nodded, though he gave Robb a sharp look. I recall the Karstarks hold some bitterness toward the Lannisters, after Jaime slew one of their men. Keep in mind, if Lord Karstark tries to rebel, I will hold his son's life in forfeit. Let him know that." Robb nodded gravely. He understood the game Tywin was playing. The old lion was ensuring that the major houses would think twice before returning to rebellion. With Harryon Karstark and Ramsay Snow in King's Landing as hostages, the threat of swift retribution would hang over them. This was the price of peace. By midday, the documents were drawn, sealed with Tywin's and Robb's respective sigils, witnessed by Kevan Lannister, Roose Bolton, the Great John, and a handful of other lords from both sides. Thus ended, on parchment, the War of the Five Kings for the North's part, though Stannis Renly, had he lived, and Balon Greyjoy might still contest for their own claims. Robb felt no satisfaction signing those documents, but he gripped the quill firmly, reminding himself it was for Sansa's life. He pressed the direwolf seal into the hot wax, relinquishing the crown he had once worn. Tywin's face remained unreadable throughout, but as the final seal was affixed, Tywin's lips curled in a faint, triumphant smile. "You have chosen wisely," Tywin remarked. "I suggest you return to the north to secure your holdings. If you wish to visit King's Landing at some point to affirm your loyalty in front of the Iron Throne, I'm certain His Grace will welcome you, provided the formalities are observed." Robb stiffened slightly at the mention of Joffrey. "Perhaps in time, Lord Tywin. For now, my sister needs me and the North needs reassurance that peace is real. We will depart soon." Tywin accepted that with a nod. "So be it. If you maintain loyalty, House Stark may yet thrive in peace." With the official business concluded, the Lannister banners began to pack up. Jaime, finally free from confinement, was offered a fresh horse. He gave one last glance at the northern lines, particularly at Brienne of Tarth, if she was present, and any others who had guarded him. He wore a faint, mocking grin, but his eyes flicked to Sansa for a moment, a spark of what might have been contrition crossing his gaze. Robb escorted Tywin out of courtesy to the edge of their camp. There, Tywin paused, turning back to regard the young wolf. "Remember, Robb Stark, a wise man once said that when you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. You have chosen to preserve your bloodline, and that may yet prove to be the better victory if you manage your house well." Robb said nothing, letting Tywin's words hang in the air. The Lannisters rode away, their brilliant crimson banners receding into the distance. Slowly, the northern camp began to stir back to life, men uncertain if they should cheer the return of Lady Sansa or mourn the loss of their independence. The Great John stood off to the side, arms folded, expression thunderous. He gave a curt inclination of his head as Robb approached, then walked away, likely to vent his frustration in private. Robb made his way to the tent where Sansa and Catelyn were waiting. He found Sansa seated in a wooden chair, nibbling at some warm bread and sipping watered wine. She looked exhausted, but a tiny spark of relief shone in her blue eyes. She rose at the sight of her brother, a wave of conflicting emotions crossing her face. Joy, guilt, lingering fear. "Robb," she said softly, "you came for me." He gathered her in a protective embrace, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Of course I did. I'm only sorry it wasn't sooner. How do you feel?" She exhaled shakily. "Safe. Safer than I've felt in months. Mother told me what you gave up to rescue me." Robb's heart constricted. "It's not your fault, Sansa. Don't ever think that. You are my sister, and I would do anything to protect you." Sansa's eyes brimmed with tears again. "Father must be." She broke off, sobs catching in her throat. Catelyn stroked her hair gently, tears in her own eyes. Robb held Sansa's hands, struggling with the knot of emotion in his chest. "We did what we had to do. We'll go home now to Winterfell. We'll see to it that the North remains strong, even under the Iron Throne's rule." Sansa nodded, eyes downcast. "I just want to go home," she whispered. Catelyn drew her daughter close. "You will, my sweet girl. Soon we'll be in Winterfell, and you'll be safe in your own chamber, by the hearth with your old friends." That image seemed to bring the faintest smile to Sansa's face, though shadows lingered in her eyes. Robb noticed how quiet she was, how she seemed perpetually on edge. He resolved to ensure that, once they were back in northern lands, she would be free to heal from her ordeal at her own pace. The camp bustled with preparations for departure. Over the next day, the northern host began its march back to Riverrun, intending to regroup before the final journey north. The Great John and some others voiced their dissatisfaction openly, lamenting that the Starks had lost the kingship. Others expressed relief that they would no longer have to face overwhelming odds in battle. For his part, Robb rode silently at the head of the column, his mother and Sansa in a carriage behind him, guarded by loyal soldiers. Roose Bolton and his men were behind them, an enigma of a man whose pale eyes seemed to weigh everything with clinical detachment. That evening, as they made camp by a winding river, Robb took a moment to walk alone along the water's edge. The moonlight shone on the rippling surface. He carried the guilt of every soldier who had died believing in the king in the north. He wondered if he had betrayed them or if he had simply saved countless more from dying. The night wind rustled the leaves overhead, and he closed his eyes, thinking of his father's words about duty and family. When he returned to the camp, he found the Great John waiting. The big man's expression was conflicted. "Your Grace, or should I say, my lord?" He almost spat the words, not in anger toward Robb, but in frustration at the situation. Robb sighed. "Your Grace was part of another life, Great John. We do what we must." The Great John's face softened for a moment. "I will not lie, Robb. I hate it, but I saw Sansa's face when she came back to us. The war has been unkind to all of us, but especially her. I cannot fault you for saving your sister. The men, they'll grumble, but they also love your house. They'll follow you still." Robb bowed his head in gratitude. "Thank you. I'm sorry that it had to be this way." The Great John reached out and clasped Robb's shoulder. "We do what we must, as you said. If I had a sister in the Lannisters' clutches, perhaps I'd have done the same. Just promise me we'll keep the North strong, no matter who sits the Iron Throne." "I promise," Robb said, and in his heart, he vowed to protect the North however he could, even if it meant forging a complicated peace with the Lannisters. They would endure, and maybe in some distant future, a chance might arise to restore the full independence they had once grasped. Days passed, and they reached Riverrun without incident. Edmure Tully received them with a mix of relief and confusion, for though Sansa was free, the terms that brought her freedom were immense. Yet the Riverlords were not as invested in the North's independence. Many were simply glad to see the fighting end and the farmland spared further ravages of war. They pledged to uphold the new peace, though resentments simmered beneath the surface. From Riverrun, Robb led his host northward, crossing the twins under tense courtesy from Walder Frey, who seemed simultaneously relieved that the Starks were no longer at war with the crown and irked that he had lost potential leverage to wring new marriage alliances from Robb. The crossing was uneventful, though the atmosphere was uneasy, with Walder Frey's suspicious eyes watching the travelers from the battlements. Once across, they made their way through the neck, feeling the chill winds intensify. The land changed gradually from the rolling greens of the riverlands to the harsher moors of the north. For Sansa, each mile was a step closer to home, though she hardly recognized how she felt. She was leaving behind the horrors of King's Landing, but she carried those memories inside her. Catelyn stayed close, offering comfort and telling stories of simpler times. When at last they arrived at Winterfell, its gray walls rising under a sky that threatened snow, Sansa burst into fresh tears. Parts of the castle were still damaged from the Ironborn occupation. Smoke-blackened stones and collapsed structures told the tale of Theon Greyjoy's brief rebellion, but the essential spirit of the place remained. The dire wolves carved into the gates, the ancient weirwood in the Godswood, the warm springs that kept the castle's corridors from the worst of the northern chill. All of it was home. Robb dismounted, gazing up at the towers that he had once thought he would rule as king. Now he re-entered as the Warden of the North, a subject of the Iron Throne. He felt a pang of regret, yet beneath it, a sense of relief to be among the familiar halls. The men who followed him entered with subdued steps, mindful that the war had changed everything. They settled in, seeing to the repairs. Sansa was given her old chambers, which were quickly cleaned and warmed. Catelyn stayed in the Lord's chambers, next to Robb, ensuring Sansa would not be alone at night. Servants bustled about, trying to make the castle lively again. Winterfell had been battered by the betrayal of Theon and the subsequent retaking. Many who had once lived within its walls were gone. In the following days, ravens carried word of Robb's peace with the crown to the various northern lords, commanding them to acknowledge the new arrangement. Some responded with grudging acceptance, others with open relief that the war's burden was lifted. A few remained silent, possibly harboring anger at the perceived betrayal of the North's independence. Robb knew he might have to visit them personally or send loyal retainers to ensure their obedience, but he hoped that the sight of Sansa, safe in Winterfell, would quell some of the resentment. As time passed, Sansa began to find some measure of solace in the old Godswood, kneeling before the heart tree that Bran and Arya had once loved. She was not like Arya, quick with a blade and rebellious, nor was she like Bran, who had found magic in the old god's eyes. But she felt a calm beneath the red leaves, and tears often fell as she prayed for the souls of her father, for Arya wherever she might be, and for her own healing. Catelyn joined her sometimes, whispering prayers of her own. Robb, for his part, spent many hours in the Solar, writing letters, planning the reconstruction, trying to chart a future. Months passed in a tense peace. The official word from King's Landing was that Lord Robb Stark, Warden of the North, had bent the knee. Joffrey, in his cruelty, mocked the young wolf for his foolish ambitions. Cersei was rumored to have seethed at losing Sansa as a hostage, but Tywin's will was law above hers, and the pragmatic advantage of halting the North's rebellion soothed the royal court's appetite for vengeance. News also trickled in of other conflicts that continued in the south. Stannis was rumored to still contest the throne, and the Iron Islands harried the western coasts. Yet, by and large, the North was spared further assault. Winter slowly took hold, blanketing the land in snow, and the Starks fortified their supplies. In Winterfell's great hall, fires roared in the hearth. One evening, Robb sat with Sansa at a long trestle table, a simple meal before them. Catelyn had retired early, exhausted by the day's tasks. The hush in the hall was broken only by the crackle of logs and the distant howling of wolves beyond the walls. Robb watched his sister carefully. She was no longer the frightened girl who had left Winterfell with their father, but she carried wounds no one could fully heal for her. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She looked up from her half-eaten bread. "I'm better," she said, managing a small, brave smile. "It still feels strange to be here without father, without Arya or Bran. But I'm so grateful to be free of King's Landing." "Thank you, Robb." He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I'd give up 100 crowns to keep you safe," he said, meaning every word. "I only wish we could have rescued you sooner." She nodded, her eyes distant. "I understand why it took time. The Lannisters, they are cruel and cunning. I heard them speak sometimes about how they'd starve the North or bribe your bannermen. They always seemed to think you'd never surrender. I almost believed them. I never dared hope you'd negotiate for me." Robb sighed. "I almost didn't, but Mother reminded me that saving you mattered more than any pride. Some of our men think I betrayed the North. Maybe I did, but I couldn't abandon you." Sansa's eyes glistened with tears. "I'm sorry you had to make that choice." He shook his head firmly. "Don't be sorry. It's the Lannisters who forced this on us. Perhaps one day the tides will shift. But for now, I'm content to know you're safe." He looked around the hall, at the banners of House Stark hanging limp in the still air. "Winterfell remains ours. That has to be enough for the time being." Sansa nodded. A hint of determination kindled in her expression. "We will rebuild our house, and maybe, in time, the North can stand proud again." Robb allowed a faint smile. "Yes, in time." Thus, life in Winterfell resumed with a semblance of normalcy. The people went about their tasks, preparing for the deep snows to come. Robb oversaw the training of the castle guard, forging alliances anew with once suspicious bannermen. Catelyn managed the household, ensuring order and care for the returning servants and small folk. Sansa, timidly at first, then with growing confidence, took up small duties as a lady of the castle, organizing meals, caring for those in need, and offering a gentle presence in the halls. The memory of her captivity shaped her into someone more watchful, more measured in her trust, but she found purpose in helping Winterfell recover. Back in King's Landing, Tywin Lannister kept a watchful eye on northern matters through reports from the hostages he held, Haryon Karstark and Ramsay Snow, ensuring that Robb did not renege on his vow. Jaime Lannister, free now, resumed his duties as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, albeit with a tarnished reputation. He visited Tywin often, discussing the future of the realm. They both knew the North's peace might be tenuous, but for now, Tywin was satisfied that he had tamed the young wolf. And so, the war between Stark and Lannister ended in a fragile accord. Robb Stark sacrificed the crown of the North, but he gained the life of his sister, Sansa, ensuring that House Stark survived to see another day. Whether the North would remain subservient to the Iron Throne in the long run or if fate would one day stir another rebellion remained to be seen. But for now, the snows began to fall around Winterfell, blanketing the land in a hush of white. Inside the Great Keep, the warmth of family reunion, however scarred by loss, offered a faint hope that, come spring, House Stark might still endure and perhaps, in some future season, rise anew. Robb Stark stood in the courtyard of Winterfell, the sky overhead a pale gray, thick with the promise of heavier snows to come. His breath plumed in the cold air as he surveyed the bustle of men and women preparing for the deepening winter. In the weeks since returning to the North with Sansa safely reclaimed from King's Landing, Robb had found himself immersed in the daily realities of ruling as warden rather than king. The crown he had once worn was gone, delivered into the hands of Tywin Lannister. Yet the responsibilities of House Stark remained as heavy as ever. He turned to see Sansa exiting the Great Keep, wrapped in a thick gray cloak trimmed with white fur. She was thinner than she had once been, her cheeks no longer the plump rose they had been in her girlhood, but at least there was color returning to them. The constant fear that had clouded her gaze in King's Landing had dulled to a lingering wariness. Each day in Winterfell helped her heal, though the trauma of her captivity still haunted her dreams. Sometimes, late at night, Robb or Catelyn would wake to hear Sansa crying out for their father, or sobbing in muffled fear, yet she refused to let that fear master her. He admired his sister's quiet resilience. There was a new steel in her eyes, as though the fragile illusions of chivalry and songs had fractured, leaving behind a more tempered soul. Sansa offered him a soft smile as she approached. "The Maester says we have enough grain stores for most of the winter," she said. "He's asked if we can arrange to bring more sheep in from the western pastures before the snow gets too deep." Robb nodded. "We should. With the fighting over, there's a chance the livestock herders will be more cooperative. The worst of the raiding is done, or so I hope. In the past year, the North had suffered not only from the Ironborn attack under Theon Greyjoy but also from scattered bandits taking advantage of the war. News of the new peace was slow to trickle out, and some criminals took advantage wherever they could." Sansa glanced around the courtyard, her hand resting on the thick woolen scarf at her throat. "I'll speak to the steward and see if we can send riders to those pastures. I want to help more. I feel so useless sometimes, just walking the halls." "You aren't useless," Robb said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Winterfell is your home as much as mine. This is our house, our seat. You do plenty already, helping Mother oversee the kitchens and the stores. The old castle runs on those details. And you're learning quickly." He tried to sound encouraging, but Sansa's eyes flickered with an old shame. "Every day in King's Landing, I felt so powerless," she admitted. "I told myself that if I ever returned home, I would do more than just stand by. I don't want to be a timid girl who just waits for someone else to decide her fate." Robb nodded, feeling the echo of his own regrets. He had decided so many fates on the battlefield, sometimes well, sometimes poorly. "You will do as much as you wish, Sansa," he promised. And no one here will force you into a marriage or humiliate you the way they did in the South. A hint of relief shone in her eyes, though she lowered her gaze, remembering the humiliation of being betrothed to Joffrey, the way he threatened and tormented her. For a moment, they stood together, the weight of memory pressing down. Then Sansa squeezed Robb's hand gently. "I know," she said, "and I'm grateful." They parted ways soon after, Sansa heading to the Maester's tower, and Robb crossing the courtyard to speak with Roose Bolton. Over these weeks, the Lord of the Dreadfort had shown an unsettling calm about the new arrangement with the Lannisters. On the surface, Roose was supportive enough, acknowledging Robb as Warden of the North. Yet Robb could not quite forget how easily Bolton had spoken of the practicality of surrendering Northern independence. In a world where trust was precious, especially after the betrayal of Theon Greyjoy, Robb found it increasingly difficult to read Roose's intentions. He found Bolton near the stables, speaking quietly with a couple of his men, who wore the flayed man's sigil on their cloaks. The men stepped back when they saw Robb approach, and Roose offered a small, polite bow. "Your Grace," Bolton said, then corrected himself softly. "My lord." Robb recognized the slip. Some of the lords still struggled with dropping the habit of calling him king in the north. He did not correct Roose. Instead, he said, "How fares the Dreadfort?" Roose lifted his cold gray eyes. "I've not yet returned to my seat, my lord. My men have been rotating back in small groups, ensuring there's no sign of Ironborn remnants or other rabble. But I hear that all is well enough there. The north grows quiet." "That's a relief," Robb said, thinking about the hostages Tywin Lannister held in King's Landing, Haryon Karstark and Ramsay Snow, Roose's bastard son. If Haryon Karstark and Ramsay remain in King's Landing, it would be wise to have the Dreadfort well garrisoned, in case House Karstark grows resentful. Roose's expression did not change. Indeed, the Karstarks are proud, and they lost men to Jaime Lannister's blade. I doubt they have forgiven you for agreeing to the exchange that allowed Jaime's release. If you need me to keep a watchful eye on them, I will. Our Trueborn houses must remain united if we are to survive the coming winter. Robb studied Roose, trying to gauge his sincerity. There was no love lost between House Bolton and House Karstark. Still, Bolton's calm acceptance of a Lannister-brokered peace sometimes made Robb uneasy. That might be wise. The Karstarks have lost their father. Lord Rickard died seeking vengeance for his son, and they blame me as well. I need someone to keep them from doing anything rash. Roose allowed a thin smile. "I will handle them carefully, my lord, and should you need a heavier hand, you know I can provide it." Robb nodded, though he felt an unease coil in his stomach. He remembered too well how his father, Ned Stark, had taught that the Boltons could be loyal allies, but only as long as it served their interests. The conversation ended with a few polite words, and Roose drifted away, quiet as a shadow. Robb exhaled, turning toward the Great Keep. At times, he felt as if he were tiptoeing along the edge of a frozen lake, each crack in the ice a reminder of how fragile this peace truly was. Inside, he sought out his mother. Catelyn was in the solar, surrounded by half a dozen sheaves of parchment, each bearing the sigil of some northern or riverlands lord. She looked up as he entered, her lips curved in the faintest smile. He saw the lines of worry etched into her face, lines that had grown deeper since Ned's death. "Robb," she said, beckoning him closer. "I've been going through the replies from the lords. Most of them have declared at least nominal acceptance of the new peace. They're relieved that Tywin Lannister won't be marching his armies north." Robb pulled a chair beside her. "And the ones who aren't relieved?" she sighed, passing him one of the letters. "Some remain quiet, House Manderly, House Serwyn, House Glover. They don't openly dispute your authority, but they haven't exactly sent messages of loyalty, either. Others, like the Riswells, simply respond with polite caution. The war cost them dear, and I think they're deciding how they feel about you kneeling before the Lannisters." Robb nodded grimly. "I'll need to visit some of them in person. Assure them that our position as Wardens of the North is stable." He hesitated, then asked softly, "Do you think Father would approve of what I've done?" surrendering the crown to save Sansa. Catelyn's eyes fell to her lap. Your father believed in protecting his family above all else. He would not begrudge you for saving your sister. But I won't lie to you, Robb. It pains me to think of all those who died declaring you king in the north. Even so, if we had continued the war, we might have lost Sansa forever. I can't imagine your father or I could have lived with that. He felt the familiar guilt rising. I know. I think of them every day, the men who shouted my name, the ones who followed me to the Whispering Wood, to the Battle of the Camps, to every skirmish. Many never returned. She took his hand. They followed you for your honor and your strength. As Warden of the North, you still have both. We must keep moving forward. The living need you. He squeezed her hand back. Thank you. I'll start planning a round of visits once the snows lighten. We need every house in the north, and we need them united. In the following weeks, as the snows did indeed begin to accumulate, Robb Stark tried to consolidate his authority. Missives were sent, bearing the Stark direwolf seal and the new pledge of fealty to King Joffrey. Most of the replies were careful and cool. No one openly defied him, but few expressed warmth about returning to the crown's authority under House Lannister. The memory of Ned Stark's execution was still fresh in the minds of many Northerners. They respected Robb, and they cherished House Stark, but that did not erase the bitterness of lost independence. Throughout the castle, repairs went on at a steady pace. The once scorched walls from Theon Greyjoy's brief occupation were rebuilt. Broken gates were replaced, and the blacksmith worked day and night forging new hinges, nails, and other necessities to make Winterfell whole again. The men who had remained loyal to House Stark took pride in the labor, while new recruits from neighboring villages trickled in, willing to serve if it meant shelter and food through the winter. Sansa participated in organizing them, speaking kindly, offering a gentle presence that reminded everyone that House Stark was not solely about swords and war. She was no queen, but she was the Lady of Winterfell in spirit, standing beside her mother and brother. The great Jon Umber was one of the few who never lost his boisterous manner, though he wore a perpetual scowl now that they were under the Iron Throne again. He would often stride into the great hall, his huge footsteps echoing, bellowing for ale, complaining that they should be out punishing Lannister men in the Riverlands. Yet he still followed Robb's orders when pressed. His fierce loyalty to House Stark ran deep, even if he despised the peace. One night, as the winter winds howled around the castle walls, Robb called a small council in the great hall. The flickering torches cast a warm glow over the faces assembled. Catelyn, Sansa, the great Jon Roose Bolton, who had lingered rather than return home, Lord Galbart Glover, and a few other trusted advisors. They gathered around a long trestle table set up near the raised dais. Robb stood at the head of the table. "I've received a raven from King's Landing," he began, his voice carrying over the crackle of the hearth. "Tywin Lannister has proposed that I come south to formally present myself to King Joffrey as Warden of the North." A low rumble of discontent passed through the gathered lords. The great Jon let out a snort that sounded like distant thunder. "He wants you crawling on your belly, does he?" Roose Bolton arched a brow. "His request is not surprising. After all, you swore fealty. Perhaps they want a public show to reassure the realm that the North is truly pacified." Robb's gaze traveled the table. "I'm loath to leave Winterfell right now, but refusing such a request might give Tywin cause to doubt our loyalty, or to create new demands. I must consider it." Catelyn frowned. "I don't like it. King's Landing is a den of vipers. Joffrey, Cersei, and even the Tyrells, none can be trusted. And you can be sure that half of them resent that Sansa is back with us." Sansa's face tightened, remembering the Red Keep's corridors. "I dread the idea of you standing before Joffrey. He'll want to humiliate you, the same way he tried to humiliate me, to prove that he holds power over you now." Robb exhaled, shoulders tight. "I know, but if I ignore the summons, Tywin will see it as a slight. The entire realm will whisper that the North is rebellious again. I would rather endure a humiliating display for a brief moment than invite another war." "And who will go with you?" the great Jon asked pointedly. "Surely not the Lady Sansa. She barely escaped from that cesspit." "No, Robb said, glancing at his sister. Sansa stays here, safe. Mother as well. I'll bring a modest retinue, some men I trust, maybe a handful of lords. Enough to show respect, but not enough to appear threatening. I'll make my vow of fealty before the Iron Throne and hope the whole matter is done quickly. Roose Bolton's pale eyes glinted with their usual unreadable calm. I could accompany you if you wish. The presence of multiple High Lords might lend more weight to your submission. I'll consider it, Robb replied, though the idea of having Roose Bolton at his side in the capital was unsettling. Yet Bolton was not wrong. Showing up alone might look weak, even desperate. I'll want the Great John to join me as well. The Great John snorted again, crossing his massive arms. As you command, my lord. But if that boy king insults you, I can't promise not to tear his head off. A faint grin touched Robb's lips. Try to resist, for all our sakes. Then the grin faded. We'll prepare to leave once the roads are passable enough to the south. The journey will be cold, and winter storms could make the King's Road treacherous. But waiting too long might send the wrong message. Catelyn clasped her hands in her lap, anxiety plain on her face. Take care, Robb. I lost your father there. I cannot lose you. He leaned over and kissed her brow. You won't lose me, mother. I'll do my duty, then come home. Sansa said nothing, but the tension in her posture spoke volumes. She had once dreamed of King's Landing as the place of chivalry, tournaments, and songs. Now she knew it for what it was, a viper's nest. She would do anything to keep her family safe from that gilded trap. The days that followed were marked by preparations. Word was sent out to the major lords of the north, announcing that Robb would be traveling south in accordance with his vow. Some lords offered men to accompany him as a show of unity. Others preferred to remain distant. Robb was careful in whom he selected. Men he trusted not to lose their temper. Men he believed would represent the north with dignity. Amidst these plans, the winter deepened. Snowdrifts piled against the walls of Winterfell, and an icy wind whistled through the gates at night, forcing men to huddle closer to their fires. The days were short, and the nights seemed to stretch on, as though the darkness meant to take over the world. Sansa and Catelyn organized the distribution of furs and blankets to the small folk, ensuring no one froze under Stark rule. The great hall swelled in the evenings with people seeking warmth and food. Robb tried to offer them some comfort, though the specter of the Lannisters' hold over them still weighed heavily on his mind. During this time, ravens from the wall brought dire news. Rumors of increased wildling activity, talk of unrest beyond the Great Ice Barrier. There were even whispers of undead foes in the far north, though many dismissed them as mere fables. Robb felt concern stirring. Jon, his half-brother, served in the Night's Watch. In the old timeline of events, Jon might have tried to warn him, or perhaps was still struggling with his own sense of duty. But the war had cut off most reliable communication. All Robb knew was that the Watch asked for more men, more supplies, more everything. And the North, battered by war, had little to spare. Finally, the day came when the snows receded just enough for travel along the King's Road. Robb had assembled a party of nearly 50 riders and a small supply train, just enough to keep them provisioned without looking like an invading force. The Great John commanded a dozen of his fierce Umber warriors, each man bundled in thick furs. Roose Bolton brought 10 men in the black and red livery of his house. Several other lords, including Lord Glover, added their own small contingents. Maester Luwin's successor, an older man named Maester Henley, worried over the weather, predicting sudden storms, but there was no delaying what had to be done. On the morning of departure, the courtyard was hushed. Sansa stood by Robb's side, eyes bright with unshed tears. Catelyn remained composed but pale, her hands folded in front of her. A light snow was falling, dusting everything in a white veil. Robb wore the thick cloak of a northern lord, pinned at the shoulder with a small direwolf brooch. He took a moment to say his farewells. Sansa embraced him first. Remember, Joffrey is cruel, but his mother is cleverer still, and Tywin is the real power. Keep your wits about you, Robb. He kissed her cheek. I will, and I'll come back. Until then, Stay safe here with Mother. Winterfell is yours to watch over." She nodded, blinking rapidly. Next, Robb stepped to his mother. Catelyn's composure cracked as she held him close. "I lost your father to that city. It took him from me," she whispered. "You must be careful." "I promise," he said, stroking her hair gently. "I've learned from Father's mistakes. I won't walk blindly into their traps." She let him go, and he climbed onto his horse, a sturdy gray courser. The Great John and the other lords followed suit, mounting up. Roose Bolton silently took his own seat, his face unreadable as ever. The small company exited Winterfell's gates to the echo of hooves crunching snow. There were no cheering crowds, no great fanfare. Only a grim departure for a city of uncertain welcomes. The journey south proved arduous. Winter's bite did not relent simply because they traveled the King's Road. Great drifts sometimes forced them to slow, and they had to set extra watches at night in case of bandits or wool. Vs. They passed scattered villages where people eyed them warily from behind shutters. The name Stark still commanded respect, but the glimpses of hunger and desperation made it clear how deeply the war and the onset of winter had affected everyone. Weeks stretched on, with the North's perpetual twilight giving way to longer days as they traveled farther south. By the time they reached the Neck, the snow had softened into cold rain. The marshes were half frozen, turning each step into a slippery hazard. The Reeds of Greywater Watch sent a small party to guide them past the worst bogs, though they were typically reclusive. Robb thanked them for their help, and the Reeds gave him sad smiles, as though they guessed that the Stark cause had changed in ways that could never be reversed. Crossing the Twins was another tense moment. Walder Frey's keep straddled the green fork of the trident like a squat, suspicious sentinel. The old man still held grudges over Robb's broken marriage pact, though with the new peace in place, he dared not openly defy House Stark. He allowed Robb and his company to cross after demanding a hefty toll in gold and a promise that House Stark would remember its debt to the Freys. Walder's watery eyes and leering grin made Robb's skin crawl, but there was no alternative but to pay and move on. Once into the Riverlands, they found the land scarred by the war. Burned farms, broken holdfasts, fields churned into mud. Though the fighting had ceased, the specter of conflict lingered. Many looked upon Robb's banners, once raised in proud rebellion, with confusion or resentment. Some spat at the mention of Lannisters and refused to believe the North had actually bent the knee. Others simply looked tired and grateful for any respite. They paused briefly at Riverrun, where Edmure Tully greeted Robb with reserved warmth. Edmure had been supportive of the war at first, but now he was battered by the knowledge of how many Riverlords had died. Still, he embraced Robb and offered food and shelter. "I pray the Lannisters won't abuse this peace," Edmure said glumly. "They've never shown mercy before." Robb had no comforting words to offer. He only said, "We'll do what we must to keep further bloodshed from befalling our people." Then he gathered his retinue and continued. At last, after many more days, they reached the area around Harrenhal, that giant ruined fortress with melted towers. It loomed against the skyline like a broken tooth. Robb and his men could sense the ill omen about the place, the curses rumored to linger in its walls. Though Tywin had once used Harrenhal as his base, it had changed hands multiple times during the war. Now, only a token Lannister garrison remained, enough to keep squatters away. They passed by swiftly, not wanting to linger in that haunted ruin. By the time King's Landing's distant walls finally came into view, Robb felt a knot of tension tighten in his gut. He had not been to the capital since before the war, back when his father served as hand under King Robert. The city rose from the horizon, ringed by its massive walls of pale stone. The Red Keep perched on the highest hill, a fortress of spires and ramparts overlooking the Blackwater Bay. Even at a distance, the air smelled of smoke, tanneries, and the tidal reek of the river. Over everything hung the sense of too many people crammed into too little space. They were met at the city gates by a contingent of gold-cloaked city watch, their cloaks a dull reflection of the Lannister color scheme. At their head stood Ser Meryn Trant of the Kingsguard, looking stiff and haughty in his white cloak. He barely inclined his head in greeting. "Lord Stark," Welcome to King's Landing. The hand of the king awaits you in the Red Keep." Robb dismounted, giving the order for his men to remain cautious. The Great John glowered openly at the gold cloaks, while Roose Bolton surveyed the streets with an unreadable expression. The city watch parted to allow the northerners to enter, their gazes flicking over the travelers with suspicion. Robb was painfully aware that half the city might still curse the name Stark for the war's devastation. Never mind that the Lannisters bore as much blame. Inside the gates, they were greeted by chaos and noise. Beggars lined the streets, reaching out with grimy hands, pleading for coin. Merchants hawked their wares, shouting over one another. The stink of unwashed bodies mixed with the tang of rotting vegetables. Robb had never grown accustomed to such squalor. Winterfell was simpler, cleaner. The Great John wrinkled his nose. "Pah! I'd rather be in the Wolfswood than in this sewer," he muttered. They pressed on, the gold cloaks clearing a path, until they ascended the city's winding roads to the Red Keep. The fortress gates yawned open, revealing a courtyard where more Lannister guards awaited them. Robb dismounted again, feeling the weight of countless eyes on him. His men followed suit, though each one appeared tense, a hand near a sword hilt. Their horses were led away by stable boys under guard. Standing at the top of a short flight of steps was none other than Tyrion Lannister, the imp, clad in rich crimson doublet trimmed with gold. He watched them approach, his mismatched eyes keen. Next to him stood a member of the Kingsguard, Ser Balon Swan, wearing his full white regalia. Tyrion sketched a half-bow. "Lord Stark, pleasure to see you. My father awaits in the throne room." Tyrion's expression was carefully composed, but Robb could sense the man's restless intelligence roving over them, taking measure of every detail. He recalled that Tyrion had once been captured by Catelyn, then freed. Now that seemed a lifetime ago. Robb returned a curt nod. "Lord Tyrion, lead on." Tyrion turned, beckoning them to follow, and led the way through the Red Keep's corridors. Guards lined the halls, the Lannister lion prominent on their tabards. The Great John muttered under his breath, "We're stepping right into the lion's maw." But Robb ignored him, forcing himself to maintain a stoic calm. He would not show fear, no matter how uneasy he felt. At last, they came to the grand doors of the throne room. Lannister guards pulled them open, revealing the vast chamber within, where the Iron Throne rose in all its jagged glory on a high dais. The throne seemed a mass of twisted, melted swords, each one representing a vanquished foe from Aegon's conquest, if the legends held true. Banners of crimson and gold draped the walls, overshadowing the Baratheon stag that still lingered in corners. The floor beneath Robb's boots was polished marble. Seated on the Iron Throne was King Joffrey Baratheon, or, as many whispered, the bastard child of Cersei and Jaime Lannister. He wore a crown of gold wrought into antler-like shapes, perched on his blonde curls. Next to the throne stood Cersei herself, resplendent in a crimson gown that accentuated her regal bearing. On Joffrey's other side stood Tywin Lannister, clad in a black doublet trimmed with gold thread, his posture rigid, face impassive. Scattered around were courtiers, knights of the Kingsguard, and highborn ladies, forming a spectacle. Robb could feel their eyes on him, some curious, some hostile, some gleeful at seeing a defeated rebel brought low. Tyrion paused at the base of the dais, stepping aside to let Robb and his retinue advance. Robb took a slow breath, stepping forward until he stood on the mosaic floor a few paces away from the throne. The Great John flanked him on one side, Roose Bolton on the other, with the rest of the Northerners arrayed behind him. Robb could almost taste the tension in the air. King Joffrey surveyed Robb with a sneer tugging at his lips. "So, the young wolf has finally come to heel." His voice echoed in the cavernous chamber, cruel satisfaction dripping from every word. Robb inclined his head slightly, forcing himself not to rise to the bait. "Your Grace, I have come as requested, to affirm my loyalty and that of the North." A ripple of murmurs went through the courtiers. Cersei's emerald eyes glimmered with triumph, and Tywin's face remained stony but satisfied. Joffrey lounged back on the Iron Throne, clearly reveling in the moment. "Kneel," he demanded, his tone high and imperious. Robb's jaw clenched. He had known this would come. Slowly, deliberately, he sank to one knee, bowing his head. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the great Jon bristle, fists tightening at his sides. But Robb had told him not to interfere. Silence fell in the throne room as everyone watched. "I, Robb Stark," he began, forcing his voice to remain steady, "do hereby reaffirm my fealty to King Joffrey Baratheon, first of his name, King of the Undulls and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm. I pledge to uphold the laws of the realm, to protect its people from harm, and to serve as Warden of the North as long as I draw breath." Joffrey canted his head, a cruel gleam in his eyes. "Very good," he said mockingly. "Though not so long ago, you styled yourself king in the North, didn't you?" Robb stayed on one knee, not daring to look up. "I did, Your Grace, but I surrendered that title as a condition of peace. I remain only a lord who serves the Iron Throne." The words tasted bitter in his mouth, but he forced them out. His father had died in this city for refusing to lie. Robb was bending himself into knots so that Sansa might never again fall into Lannister hands. Joffrey's lips twisted. "I remember the day you lost your father's head. Perhaps you should too. This realm doesn't need northern kings." He was deliberately provoking him, but Robb refused to let his anger boil over. Instead, he answered quietly, "I remember my father's death, Your Grace. I swore no more blood would be shed if I could prevent it." Joffrey snorted and looked to his mother, who merely gave a cold, approving smile. Tywin then stepped forward, his posture that of a warden overshadowing the king. "Your Grace," Tywin intoned, "Lord Stark has made his submission. The terms of his oath are clear. The North is under the Iron Throne's authority, with House Stark as wardens. It would be prudent to accept and move on to matters of governance. Winter is upon us, and we have other concerns." Tywin did not say it lightly. He was the true power in this hall. Joffrey scowled, but after a moment, he waved a dismissive hand. "Fine," he said petulantly. "Rise, Lord Stark. Let it never be said that Joffrey Baratheon is unmerciful." Robb stood, fighting the urge to glare at the boy king. He stole a glance at Cersei, who watched him with a faint arch of her brow, as though assessing whether he might snap. The next moment, she turned her attention to Tywin, who murmured something under his breath. Robb could not hear the words, but he suspected they were about logistical matters. The North supply lines, perhaps, or the hostages in King's Landing. Joffrey yawned theatrically. "We'll have a feast tonight," he declared. "Lord Stark shall dine with us in the Great Hall, and we'll see how well he dances to our tune. Unless you object, grandfather." Tywin inclined his head. "A feast to commemorate peace between North and South is appropriate, Your Grace." He fixed a cool gaze on Robb. "You will attend, of course." Robb gave a curt nod. "I will, my lord." "Then we shall see you later," Tywin said, dismissing him with a wave. Cersei's lips twitched in a faint smirk, while Joffrey rolled his eyes as though bored already. The courtiers began to murmur among themselves, and the Lannister guards stepped forward to guide Robb and his men out of the throne room. As Robb turned, he heard Joffrey's voice ring out behind him in a casual aside. "And see to it that the Wolf's men keep to themselves. I don't want any trouble in my city. If they cause any disruption, we'll have them thrown in the dungeons." The Great Jon growled low, and Roose Bolton placed a restraining hand on his arm. Robb whispered, "Hold, Great Jon." As they exited the throne room, they walked back down the corridor, gold cloaks trailing them like a chain of silent watchers. Robb kept his expression impassive, though inwardly he felt a churning frustration. The entire city reeked of arrogance and cruelty, but he could not fight them here, not now. Tyrion Lannister awaited them outside, leaning on his staff of office. He offered a small, ironic smile. "Well done, my lord. You managed not to punch my nephew in his smug little mouth. That alone deserves a toast." Robb stared at Tyrion, uncertain if the dwarf mocked him, but Tyrion's tone held a note of genuine weariness. "He is your king," Robb answered quietly. "Or so the realm says." Tyrion gave a soft laugh, then waved his hand. "I'll have one of the stewards show you to your rooms. You'll find them adequate if not lavish. My father wants to keep you close at hand. Enjoy the feast tonight, and remember, in King's Landing you can never have too many friends. Or too few, depending on how you see it." Robb inclined his head and did not reply. Tyrion signaled a steward, a wiry man with a stooped posture, who led the northern party through a maze of corridors. They eventually arrived at a suite of chambers in a lesser wing of the Red Keep, away from the more opulent quarters. The Great John slammed the door shut once they were inside, fuming. "By the gods, I wanted to strangle that little bastard on the throne. Did you see the way he looked at you?" Robb removed his cloak, tossing it onto a wooden chair. "I saw it, but we can't provoke him. Tywin is the real threat anyway. Joffrey is just a rabid dog that Tywin keeps on a leash. Yet that dog has teeth," Roose Bolton noted quietly, "and an eagerness to use them if provoked." Robb nodded. "Precisely. We'll do what we must. Endure the feast, affirm our loyalty, and see if we can glean any useful information. Then, I want us to leave the city as quickly as we can. The North needs us more than the Lannisters ever will." The day wore on, and as evening fell, the great hall of the Red Keep was made ready for feasting. Robb dressed in his best doublet of dark gray wool, embroidered with the direwolf sigil on the breast. The Great John wore his furs as proudly as ever, while Roose Bolton appeared in black velvet, the subtle flayed man of House Bolton stitched in red thread on one sleeve. They entered the hall to find tables groaning with roasted meats, flagons of wine, and platters of fruit. Minstrels played lively tunes, though the music clashed with the underlying tension. Joffrey sat at the head of the hall, with Cersei on his left and Tywin on his right. To Tywin's right was a vacant seat, presumably for Robb. Tyrion was further down the table, next to Grand Maester Pycelle and Ser Meryn Trant. Robb forced himself to approach, each step heavy. Joffrey beckoned him to sit. The Great John and Bolton were directed to seats among other lords, likely so the Lannisters could keep Robb under direct scrutiny. Tywin barely looked at Robb as he seated himself, but Cersei offered a languid smile. "Lord Stark, you must be relieved to see how prosperous King's Landing is, now that your rebellion has ended." Robb controlled his expression. "I'm relieved to see the realm at peace," he said carefully. Joffrey laughed, a high, sharp sound. "Peace, yes, as long as your savage northerners behave themselves. I hear you keep wolves in your castle, savage beasts. Do you plan to keep them fed on the flesh of your enemies?" A hush fell around them. Robb's spine stiffened at the insult, but he only answered, "We keep wolves in the forests of the north, your grace. They prefer deer to men." Cersei sipped her wine, arching a brow. Joffrey gave another thin laugh, apparently disappointed at the lack of reaction. Tywin cut in smoothly. "We have no need of such trifles, Joffrey. Let us speak of more pressing matters. Lord Stark, have your scouts reported any further Ironborn presence along the northern coasts?" Grateful for the shift in topic, Robb turned to Tywin. "Last I heard, the Iron Islands remain fractious. Balon Greyjoy still proclaims himself king of the Isles, but with the North no longer at war, he has lost some of his momentum. I expect small raids might continue, but nothing on the scale of an invasion." Tywin nodded thoughtfully. "Good. The Crown has limited resources to spare for chasing Greyjoy raiders. I trust you will handle them as needed." Robb forced a measured nod. "We will." Their conversation continued, touching on trade routes, rumors of bandits, and the supply lines for winter. Cersei interjected now and then with barbed comments, though Tywin steered the discussion with the measured calm of a man who had orchestrated countless political outcomes. All the while, courtiers watched, feigning interest in their own conversations while eavesdropping. Joffrey, for his part, grew bored quickly and began tossing scraps of food to a pair of hounds lying near his chair. Robb endured the meal with as much composure as he could muster. The food was rich, too rich for his northern tastes, and the wine flowed freely, though he sipped sparingly. He was keenly aware that drunkenness could be used against him. The Great John, seated across the hall, glowered every time he looked over, but managed to contain his usual bellowing. Roose Bolton, by contrast, seemed to blend in almost effortlessly, holding quiet exchanges with nearby lords. Now and then, Robb caught glimpses of Tyrion, who raised his goblet in a mocking toast from time to time, as if to say, "Good luck." When the feast finally ended, Robb felt a wave of relief. He bowed to Joffrey, who yawned and waved him away like an afterthought. Tywin, however, remained watchful. Robb guessed that the Lannister patriarch would likely request a private audience soon enough. For now, Robb and his retinue withdrew to their chambers in the Red Keep, flanked by gold cloaks. The corridors were lit by flickering torches, casting shifting shadows. Robb could not shake the feeling of being caged. They reached their rooms, and the Great John burst out in a low, furious whisper. "I've had enough of that little toad on the throne. Next time he insults the North, you'll keep silent." Robb cut him off just as quietly. "We cannot provoke them. We came here to confirm peace. Any slip could give Tywin an excuse to attack us." The Great John's chest rose and fell heavily, but at last he nodded. "Only for you, Robb. Only for you." Roose Bolton, standing apart, offered a small, thin smile. "A wise policy. Lord Tywin can be gracious when it suits him. We should see to it that we do not change his mind about letting us keep our heads." With that grim agreement, they parted for the night. Robb paced his chamber for a time, staring out the window at the moonlit sprawl of King's Landing. Tens of thousands of people slept in the city below, indifferent or hostile to the presence of the Northern Lord. He thought of Sansa, safe in Winterfell, and felt the faint sting of all he had given up to rescue her. He felt no regret at saving her, but the bitterness of the cost remained. The next morning, a message arrived bearing Tywin Lannister's seal. Robb read it in silence. Tywin requested, or demanded more accurately, a private audience in his solar. Robb dressed himself accordingly and went, accompanied by only one guard. The Great John insisted on coming, but Robb persuaded him that it would only antagonize Tywin. So it was that Robb found himself alone in the Lion's Den, Tywin's private quarters, high in the Red Keep. The solar was sparsely decorated, dominated by a large table covered in maps and ledgers. A single chair awaited Robb, opposite Tywin's seat. The hand of the king essay. T behind the table, writing calmly with a quill. He did not glance up as Robb entered. A guard closed the door behind Robb, leaving them in heavy silence. Only after a moment did Tywin set down his quill and lift his pale green eyes. "Lord Stark," he said evenly. "Sit." Robb complied, folding his hands on his lap. Tywin's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts as he steepled his fingers. "We have concluded our war with you as a rebel. Now you are a subject of the crown once more. This is beneficial for the realm, provided you remain loyal. Yet loyalty is best ensured through mutual advantage. Do you agree?" Robb studied the older man's face, noting the faint lines etched by age and war. "I do, my lord. Mutual advantage keeps the peace." "Good," Tywin said. "The North is vast, and with winter tightening its grip, you have burdens of your own. King's Landing must look to secure the grain and resources we need, especially if we face threats from Stannis Baratheon or the Iron Islands. Our arrangement must therefore be clear. You will keep your domain quiet, quell any potential uprisings among your bannermen, and ensure the Iron Throne's taxes are collected. In return, we will leave you to govern as warden." Robb felt the tension coiling in his stomach. Taxes were always a point of contention. The North, with fewer people spread over a large area, often chafed under Southern demands. But he nodded. "I understand. We will do our part." Tywin watched him closely. "Your sister, Sansa Stark, is beyond the crown's immediate reach. That is part of our agreement. It still chafes certain parties, Queen Cersei in particular, who believe Sansa might be used for other alliances. Nonetheless, I support our present arrangement, so long as it remains beneficial." Should you attempt to break away again or incite rebellion, your sister would be fair game if we ever retook her." A cold wave of anger and fear washed through Robb. Tywin was not even subtle. He was reminding Robb that the Iron Throne still considered Sansa a pawn if the Starks stepped out of line. Robb forced his voice to remain steady. "I have no desire to break the peace. We are done with war." Tywin inclined his head, satisfied. "See that you remain so. If the North is threatened by Ironborn or wildlings, the Crown may offer limited assistance, but do not rely on it. You will be expected to handle your own region. We have enough concerns in the south." Robb said nothing, letting Tywin continue. The hand's tone was clinical, as though he were discussing ledger entries. "You may return home within the week, if you wish. We will expect frequent reports on the state of the North, trade, taxes, any sign of unrest. On occasion, the king may call you to court. I trust you will heed such summons." "I will," Robb said, "but I ask that you treat my men with respect while we remain in the city. The Great John has no love for the Lannisters, but he follows my lead." Tywin's expression hinted at a trace of disdain. "The large fool. Yes, I've heard his roars echo through the corridors. As long as he causes no harm, we'll leave him be. But if he raises a hand against the king or the royal family, there will be no mercy." Robb nodded, controlling his temper. "Understood." Tywin flicked his gaze to a map on the table, then back to Robb. "One more matter. The seat of House Bolton. Roose Bolton has indicated he wishes to strengthen his position in the north, possibly seeking to marry a southern lady to forge new ties. He approached me about it. I have not yet given him an answer, but I mention it because you should be aware of your Bannerlord's ambitions." Robb could not hide his surprise. He knew Roose to be politically shrewd, but he had not expected the man to approach Tywin directly about marriage alliances. "I appreciate you telling me, my lord. House Bolton is loyal, but I must ensure all marriages meet with my approval as warden." Tywin shrugged. "That is your domain, though if House Bolton seeks a match among the Lannisters or their allied houses, you would be wise not to forbid it without cause. We want to avoid any friction that might break this fragile peace." Robb felt a flicker of apprehension. Bolton forging closer ties with the Lannisters? That sounded like a recipe for trouble, especially given Roose's penchant for cruelty. But he only said, "I'll keep it in mind." Tywin took up his quill again, as if dismissing Robb from his presence. "That is all, unless you have further questions." For a moment, Robb hesitated, wanting to ask if Tywin knew anything about Arya, his missing sister. Rumors said she might have been in the Riverlands or traveling with outlaws, but he suspected Tywin had no intention of telling him anything that could strengthen House Stark. So he merely bowed. "No, my lord." Tywin gave a curt nod, and Robb left the solar, stepping into the corridor where his guard waited. He felt as though he had just survived a skirmish, words instead of swords, but no less dangerous. Roose Bolton's potential alliance with a southern house worried him. He would have to be vigilant. The rest of that day passed in tense waiting. Robb felt the Red Keep's walls closing in around him. He had no desire to linger. The feasting and posturing of the court were not to his taste, and the longer he stayed, the more chances arose for some slight that could ignite conflict. He dined in their assigned chambers with the Great John and Bolton, discussing the conversation with Tywin. Bolton feigned ignorance about a marriage alliance, merely smiling and saying, "I explore many possibilities, my lord. One never knows what doors might open." The Great John guffawed at that. "Marry a southern lady? I'd sooner marry a bear. At least the bear's fur would keep me warm." Bolton did not laugh, only sipped his wine with a thin-lipped smile. Within 3 days, Robb's party made ready to depart. Officially, Joffrey bestowed the king's blessing on Robb for safe travels, though it was clearly a formality. Cersei and Tyrion both observed the departure with cautious expressions, while Tywin remained distant. The gold cloaks opened the city gates, and once again Robb found himself on horseback, leading his men away from King's Landing. A throng of small folk watched them go, some sneering, some indifferent. As they rode out onto the King's Road, The Great John let out a breath. "Never again," he said, glancing at Robb. "Never again do I want to set foot in that damn city." "Agreed," Robb muttered, urging his horse forward. "We'll get home to Winterfell and focus on what matters. The North, our people, and surviving this long winter." Roose Bolton rode a slight distance behind them, overshadowed by the Umber warriors. His silence spoke volumes. Robb wondered what thoughts flickered behind those pale eyes. Did he resent the new status quo, or did he plan to capitalize on it? Regardless, the next step was returning to the cold, wide lands of the North and ensuring no further rebellions bubbled up. He had given up the kingship. He would not have it undone by a betrayal from within his own ranks. They traveled north again, ironically facing milder weather than on their southward journey, as if winter had paused in certain regions. The neck was still damp and cold, but passable. The Freys still demanded tolls at the Twins, sneering as they counted the coins. And beyond, the Riverlands still bore the scars of war, though some villages were beginning to rebuild. Lord Edmure Tully greeted them briefly at Riverrun, inquiring about King's Landing, to which Robb only said that the Lannisters remained firmly in power. Edmure shook his head with a grim expression, but offered no further comment. At last, they crossed into the north, feeling the air turn sharp as a blade. The snow grew deeper, the forests thicker, and the nights longer. Despite the hardships, Robb felt a surge of relief at seeing the familiar expanse of pines and rocky hills. This was his land, his father's land. He might not wear a crown, but he was a Stark, and Winterfell awaited. When they finally reached Winterfell, the gates opened to welcome them. Sansa and Catelyn stood in the courtyard, cloaked in heavy fur. Sansa's eyes lit with relief at the sight of Robb. He dismounted at once, embraced his mother, and then Sansa, feeling the tension of the trip melt away at their warmth. The Great John gave a mighty stretch and declared that he would drink himself senseless tonight, free of the Lannister stench. Catelyn asked quietly, "How did it go?" Robb sighed. "They demanded I kneel before Joffrey publicly, which I did. Tywin hammered home that we must remain loyal or face consequences. Beyond that, they mostly left us alone. I want no more of that place, Mother." She nodded, stroking his cheek as though he were a child again. "I'm glad you're safe. That is what matters." Sansa hovered near, searching his face. "Did you see the Queen? Did you speak with Joffrey?" He glanced at her, remembering the Boy King's cruel eyes. "I did. He is exactly as you warned, if not worse. But it's over now." She shuddered, hugging herself. "I'm sorry you had to endure him." He brushed a strand of her auburn hair aside. "Don't be. We're safe here, and the North is secure for now." They moved inside, shedding travel gear, ignoring the snow tracked across the floors. Warm braziers and a fire roared in the great hall, and Catelyn ordered food to be brought for them. The assembled Northerners found seats, and soon steaming bowls of stew and freshly baked bread arrived. Robb sank into a chair near the fire, relief flooding him. Home. It might not be the seat of an independent king, but it was still the seat of House Stark. Over the next few days, Robb told them of the King's Landing events in detail, and Sansa's face grew paler at each mention of Joffrey's sneers. She found comfort only in hearing that Tywin, not Joffrey, guided the realm's politics. Catelyn listened intently, nodding when Robb spoke of potential southern alliances for House Bolton. Her brow furrowed in concern at the thought, but she withheld judgment until she could speak with Roose privately. Winterfell settled back into its routines, the chill winds howling outside while people huddled in the safety of the castle. Snow piled high, and men with shovels toiled daily to keep the main courtyards clear. In the Godswood, the Heart Tree stood silent, its ancient face seeming to watch over the courtyard and the family that sought solace beneath its red leaves. Catelyn visited the Sept daily, while Sansa sometimes joined her. Robb preferred the Godswood, where he knelt under the weirwood's gaze and prayed for the strength to lead his people through the cold and the darkness. Not all the North was at peace, though. Letters arrived from various lords, including Lord Wyman Manderley of White Harbor, who wrote that pirates and outlaws had been spotted off the coast. likely Ironborn stragglers. Lord Glover reported that some disgruntled Karstark men had been muttering about vengeance, still furious that Haryon Karstark was held hostage in King's Landing. And scattered rumors reached Winterfell that roving bands of raiders harassed smaller villages, taking what they could to survive the harsh winter. Robb recognized that their next challenge was not a new war, but the slow grind of winter scarcity and lingering resentments. He convened councils where the Great John, Roose Bolton, and other lords debated how to handle these threats. Some argued for swift reprisals against any house that showed disloyalty. Others counseled caution, urging the use of negotiations and offers of aid. Every decision felt like stepping on a tightrope. One misstep and Tywin might label them rebels again, or the Northern Lords might label Robb a weak puppet of the Iron Throne. Amid these pressures, Sansa began to blossom in a surprising way. She took on more responsibilities in the castle, organizing winter stores, planning distributions for the small folk, and overseeing the sewing of new cloaks and garments to keep everyone warm. Catelyn remarked that Sansa was becoming a true lady of Winterfell, steady and caring. Sometimes Sansa wore a faraway look, as though remembering her father's old lessons or her younger dreams. But she persevered. One evening, as Sansa inspected some wool shipments in the yard, Robb approached. A gentle snow was drifting from the gray sky. Sansa looked up at him, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "All this wool from the mountain clans will help clothe the people in the outlying villages," she said. "I've already asked for volunteers to help with the sewing. I even plan to do some stitching myself." Robb smiled. "You're doing good work, Sansa. Father would be proud." She lowered her gaze, flushed with both humility and sorrow. "I miss him every day. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough to honor him. He always said a good ruler should think of his people as his children, in a way." Robb nodded, recalling Ned's gentle guidance. "Father believed in responsibility. You're following that path well. The North needs kindness and order both." She regarded him a moment. "And do you feel you have enough kindness and order, Robb?" He let out a wry breath, glancing around the courtyard. "I feel the weight of everything all the time. I gave up the crown. Half our lords resent me for that. The other half are glad we survived. And somewhere out there, our sister Arya is missing, Bran and Rickon too. We have no word of them, only rumors that Theon took Winterfell and then lost them. I try to keep going. For you, for Mother, for everyone here, but I don't feel like I have enough of anything." Her eyes shone with sympathy. She reached out and squeezed his arm. "We'll endure," she said. "We're Starks, after all." He found a small, grateful smile in response. "Yes, we are." The weeks turned to months, and winter's grip tightened. The roads became impassable in many places. Snowdrifts towered along the walls of Winterfell, forcing men to labor constantly to keep the main gates clear. Hunters were sent out to bring in game, but yields were lean. Grain stores dwindled more rapidly than Robb liked, and some of the smaller villages began to suffer. He organized rationing, sending riders to check on those in danger of starvation. Still, the hardships mounted, and the cold nights felt endless. Amid these challenges, tensions with the Karstarks finally boiled over. One frigid morning, a raven arrived bearing news from Karhold. A group of Karstark men had threatened to withhold tribute to Winterfell unless Haryon Karstark was returned from King's Landing. Some had gone so far as to declare that Robb was no true Stark for giving up the crown. They whispered that they might declare their own heir as king in the north. It was rebellious talk, though as yet unorganized. Robb read the message by the flickering light of a torch in the Great Hall. His face grew grim. "They're pushing me," he said to the Great John and Roose Bolton, who stood beside him. "They blame me for Haryon's capture, though it was Tywin's demand that he be a hostage. They forget that it was Jaime Lannister who killed their kin." The Great John huffed. "They want someone to blame, and you're closer than the Lannisters." "What do we do, my lord?" Roose Bolton touched his chin thoughtfully. "We could send a small force to Karhold to remind them of the Warden's authority. If we do nothing, their seditious talk might spread." Robb's instincts rebelled at the idea of using force on a northern house. But the memory of his father's execution in King's Landing, the knowledge that Tywin Lannister would pounce on any sign of open rebellion, these weighed on him. Very well, but I'll go myself. I won't let the Karstarks say I sent a ravening host without even trying to talk. The Great John offered a fierce grin, slapping his mailed chest. I'll accompany you. Let them bark. We'll show them who's truly got the bigger teeth. Roose Bolton's eyes flickered with interest. And I shall remain in Winterfell to ensure all is secure here. Unless you wish my presence, my lord. Robb considered. Something in him hesitated to leave Bolton behind, but it made sense for someone of high standing to remain in charge. Stay and watch over the castle. I'll take a few dozen men, enough to handle trouble if it arises. With that plan, Robb prepared to depart. Catelyn and Sansa protested, fearing for his safety in the midst of winter storms, but he reassured them that he was simply going to speak with his vassals and remind them of their duties. He promised to return swiftly. So, once more, he found himself riding out of Winterfell in the icy dawn, this time heading east toward Carhold. The Great John rode at his side, as did a contingent of reliable men, veterans who had followed Robb through battle. They encountered deep snowdrifts that slowed their progress, and more than once they had to clear paths by hand, but eventually they pressed on. The northern lights danced in the night sky, eerie curtains of green and purple shimmering over fields of white. In the daytime, the sky was usually gray or pale blue, the sun a distant glimmer. Villages along the way offered them meager shelter. Some folks recognized Robb and bowed. Others stared with hollow eyes, too concerned about survival to care about southern politics. At last, they neared Carhold's domain. The fortress loomed on a rocky promontory overlooking a frozen bay. The towers bristled like fangs against the snow. Men in Karstark colors patrolled the walls, eyes narrowed against the biting wind. Robb wondered if they would bar the gates, but a horn sounded, and after some tense minutes, the portcullis creaked upward to allow them entry. Inside, the courtyard was nearly empty. Only a handful of Karstark knights waited, flanked by black-haired men who bore the sunburst sigil of the Karstarks. One stepped forward, removing his helmet to reveal a lined face with a streak of gray in his beard. "My Lord Stark," he said, "I am Ser Arnaz Karstark, cousin to Harrion." Robb dismounted, handing the reins to one of his men. The Great John did likewise, scanning the courtyard. "Ser Arnaz," Robb greeted. "I come to speak with Lord Karstark, whichever Karstark now holds authority in Ricard's absence." Arnaz glanced warily at the Great John and the Northmen who accompanied Robb. "Harrion would be our lord, but he is a hostage in the south. Torrhen Karstark, Harrion's uncle, has been handling matters in his stead. He's within." Robb nodded. "Take us to him, please." Arnaz led them into the main keep, a somber hall draped with old banners. The fire in the hearth was low, and the cold seemed to seep through the walls. At a long table sat Torrhen Karstark, a gaunt man who bore a resemblance to the late Ricard Karstark. The same angular cheeks, the same deep-set eyes. He regarded Robb with a mixture of frustration and wariness. "Lord Stark," Torrhen said, rising stiffly, "I did not expect you to come in person." Robb offered a curt inclination of his head. "When we receive word that your men speak openly of withholding tribute and question my loyalty to the North, I can hardly ignore it. We are in the midst of winter. We can't afford division." Torrhen's mouth twisted bitterly. "Division? You speak of division. Where was your consideration for our house when you let Jaime Lannister go free after he slew our kin?" Robb had expected this. The Karstarks' hatred for Jaime was well known. He forced himself to remain calm. "I arranged Jaime's release to secure Sansa's freedom and end the war. Harrion was taken as a hostage by Tywin's demand. If I had refused, Sansa would lick. Ely still be in Joffrey's hands or dead, and the war would have dragged on. How many more Karstarks would have died?" A muttering rose from the men behind Torrhen. He banged a fist on the table. "And what is that to the Karstarks now? We have lost our lord, Ricard, who died seeking vengeance, and we have lost Harrion to the Lannisters. The name Karstark is diminished." Robb's voice hardened. Don't presume House Stark is untouched by loss. My father was executed in King's Landing. My brothers are missing, yet I am here, facing you in good faith. We must stand together to see this winter through." Torrhen's lip curled. "Stand together under the Iron Throne's heel? That's what you've done. You gave up your crown." The Great John let out a low growl at that, stepping forward. "You forget your place, Torrhen Karstark. He's our warden, and you owe him fealty. Watch your tongue." Torrhen glared. "And if I refuse, will you shed Karstark blood right here? Are we all to kneel for Lannister scraps?" Robb raised a hand, silencing the Greatjon's retort. He addressed Torrhen directly. "I do not want your blood, but if you declare open rebellion, Tywin Lannister will see it as my failing. He might punish not just you but the entire North. Houses that had nothing to do with your anger would suffer. Is that truly what you want?" Some of the Karstark men shifted uneasily. Torrhen swallowed, his bitterness palpable. "We only want Harrien back. We want justice for the blood spilled by Jaime Lannister. If you cannot secure that, if you cannot restore our house, then why should we follow you?" Robb felt the sting of that question. In truth, he had few answers. Jaime Lannister was beyond his reach now, and Tywin would never return Harrien unless the North remained docile. "I can't promise Jaime's head," he said quietly, "but I can promise that if Harrien is ever harmed in the capital, I will demand justice. As for the future, House Karstark remains a vital banner of the North. I'm prepared to offer you additional lands or relief if the winter leaves you struggling. That is what a warden does. He provides for his vassals." Torrhen let out a hollow laugh. "Lands, is it? What use are more fields under the snow?" Robb kept his tone level. "When spring comes, you'll have the chance to rebuild. Times are dire, yes, but let's not forget that the entire North must unite to survive. The Lannisters can't feed us. We must feed ourselves. So I offer to help you secure enough resources to see your people through the worst months. But I need your word that House Karstark will remain loyal, that you won't plot another revolt behind my back." The tension in the hall was thick. Torrhen stared at Robb, resentment warring with pragmatism. Finally, a weary note crept into his voice. "What choice do we have? You hold the North with the rest of the banners, and the Lannisters hold Harrien. If we rebel, we'll be crushed." Robb nodded, inwardly relieved that Torrhen had at least a shred of sense. "Then we have an understanding?" Slowly, grudgingly, Torrhen inclined his head. "I, Lord Stark, we won't withhold tribute. The Karstarks won't raise arms against you. But I expect you to hold to your word if the chance arises to bring our Harrien home." Robb's eyes flickered with sincerity. "If that chance arises, I'll do everything in my power." He truly meant it. He had no desire for any northern hostage to remain under Lannister control. But the reality was that Tywin would not simply release Harrien without cause. With that, the immediate crisis was defused. Robb and the Great John spent the night at Carhold, ensuring the men saw their presence as a sign of unity rather than an invading force. The mood remained tense, but no open conflict erupted. By morning, Torrhen pledged fealty anew, albeit without warmth. Robb accepted, aware that forced loyalty was better than no loyalty at all in these times. Upon returning to Winterfell, snow swirling around them, Robb felt a mixture of exhaustion and guarded optimism. He had averted the Karstark rebellion, at least for now, but how many more houses might nurse similar resentments? The cost of their capitulation to the Iron Throne was woven through every corner of the North, from the Skagos Islands to the mountains. He was warden, not a king, and many of his people would not forget that distinction. Life in Winterfell settled into a rhythm of harsh survival. Sansa's distribution of supplies helped keep the worst suffering at bay. Catelyn presided over daily audiences, listening to the petitions of farmers and villagers who trekked to Winterfell for aid. The Great John assisted with organizing hunts for game in the Wolfswood, while Roose Bolton, quiet and efficient, ensured that punishments for poaching or banditry were swift. At times, rumors circulated that Bolton was too cruel, exacting his own brand of justice beyond what Robb authorized, but nothing was ever confirmed. Robb tried to keep a close eye on him, though it was not always possible. As the snows deepened, ravens arrived less frequently from the south, their flights perilous. One or two managed to bring word that King Joffrey was engaged to Margaery Tyrell, forging a powerful alliance for the Iron Throne. There was also news that Stannis Baratheon still refused to surrender his claim, though no major battles had occurred in recent months. The realm felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for winter's end, or for some new crisis to erupt. Months passed in this hibernation. Torches burned low in the long nights, families huddled around hearths, and the North endured. Sansa poured her energies into caring for the small folk, while Catelyn prayed at the sept for the souls of Ned, Bran, Rickon, and Arya. Robb hunted in the forests, forging alliances with mountain clan leaders who braved the cold to trade pelts and meat. The constant drone of wind through Winterfell's towers was a mournful lullaby, reminding everyone that they were far from the rest of the world, alone in the cold. On one chill morning, as Robb walked the ramparts, gazing out over the frost-laden expanse, he heard the distant call of a horn. It came from the direction of the Kingsroad Gate. Sentries hurried about, shouting that a messenger approached. Robb made his way down the winding steps to the courtyard, where he saw a lone rider half-frozen, slumped in the saddle of a weary horse. Guards rushed to help the man dismount, and Robb recognized him as one of the Night's Watch couriers, shrouded in black cloaks and furs. The man nearly collapsed in the snow, panting, I bear word from the Lord Commander, urgent message. The dead walk." Robb's blood ran cold. He grabbed the man by the shoulders. "Steady, friend. You're from the Wall." The courier nodded, eyes wild with exhaustion. "Aye, White Walkers. Whites. The Watch is under siege. They need aid. Jon Snow sends warning. The others are real." The courtyard fell silent, except for the moan of the wind. Guards and small folk exchanged looks of fear and confusion. Robb felt a chill deeper than the winter itself. He had heard rumors and old stories, but like so many, he had never truly believed. Now, a messenger from the Night's Watch stood before him, trembling with terror, speaking of the dead rising beyond the wall. He looked up at the ramparts where Sansa had appeared, pale-faced, and behind her Catelyn, hand covering her mouth. The Great Jon stood nearby, jaw set in grim resolution. Roose Bolton emerged from the shadows, observing with narrowed eyes. 1,000 thoughts raced through Robb's mind. If this was true, if the threat was real, the North faced danger beyond anything the Lannisters could inflict. And the realm, Joffrey, Tywin, all of them, would they even believe it? Would they care? Robb helped the courier into the keep, calling for hot wine and a seat by the fire. As the man babbled of ice-eyed monsters and undead hordes, Robb's sense of duty flared. He was the warden of the North, and the North might soon face the living dead. War, crowns, and old grudges seemed small compared to that horror. All at once, he understood that everything might change again. He turned to his mother and sister, who stood nearby, listening with dread. "We'll hear this man out," he said firmly, "and then we'll send ravens to every holdfast in the North, and to King's Landing if we must. If there's a threat to the Wall, then the entire realm is in danger. No more secrets, no more divisions." Sansa looked at him, her blue eyes wide but resolute. "We will stand. We're Starks." "Yes," Robb agreed, feeling a new weight of responsibility, heavier than any crown or vow of fealty. "We're Starks, and winter is truly here." With that, he lifted his head, staring out the hall window toward the endless snows. For all the war and politicking, for all the bargains made with Tywin Lannister, a far older terror had awakened in the North. In that moment, Robb understood with startling clarity that the safety of his family, the survival of the North, perhaps even the survival of the entire kingdom, would depend on how they faced the others. Pride and crowns and old grudges would mean nothing if the dead swept over them. And so, renewed with a grim purpose, Robb Stark prepared to do what his father would have done. Protect the living, no matter the cost. The war with the Lannisters was done, But a war with death itself had only just begun.